Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world and the time you are listening. This video also, don't forget to like it before and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story. I was hired to restore a mural in an abandoned church, but there was something alive in the painting. Are they going to pump this out? Alec asked as he stepped awkwardly into the flooded basement, the water rising to just a little below his knees. I don't know, I said. Aren't they renovating the place? I don't think so, I said. It's just this mural they're after. Well, we're going to need it dry, Alec grumbled. Can't run electricity down here like this. Gonna need it for the imaging equipment too. Yeah, I agreed. Plus, God knows what's in this water. Some of these tunnels must lead off to the catacombs. You can't be serious, he cried, his flashlight suddenly snapping from one bare stone wall to another. Are there actually bodies down here? It's a church, I said. They buried people here. Not recently, but yeah, it has catacombs. Don't worry, they're not just stacked up like firewood in some room. There's gates and stuff to stop people desecrating them. Alec shone his light at the water lapping around his feet and curled his lip. It was the color of old coffee. I don't know how anyone can expect us to work in these conditions. For the money they're paying, I'd work waist deep in the Thames, I told him. The guy's last painting sold for $7 million. You know how excited the church was when they found out he'd been down here in the 70s? Whatever he put on the walls, they charged him with vandalism then. But now there's money on the line. They want whatever he did restored, packed up, and sold. Alec huffed. Where is the damn thing anyway? I stopped momentarily to get my bearings. Down here. I waved him on, and we delved deeper into the basement, as I led us through a strange mix of large rooms and awkward tunnels carved directly into the rock, some of which you had to stoop just to fit in. Many of the rooms we passed had old boxes in them. One had furniture draped with once white sheets that were now moldy and stained. Another had an old piano, the lid still up. Thankfully, it wasn't far, a few minutes at most. Once we found the door, we both put our shoulders to it and forced it open. Water must have built up because it came pouring out at waist height and nearly took us both of our feet. Fucking stinks. Alec cried over the roar of water, but I ignored him. Once it was safe, we stepped inside, and it was as if our lights grew dimmer and the air colder. A distinct sense that we'd crossed a threshold. A long and empty room where the only sound was water dripping somewhere in the distance. I was about to suggest we'd taken a wrong turn, but then I saw one of the walls had been painted black, and there was something strange about it. It was only when you let your eye linger that you saw the brush strokes, each no thicker than my thumb. They covered every inch of it and caught the dim light of our torches, shimmering with brief flashes of iridescent color that were impossible to focus on. The longer I looked, the more I saw great depths in that work. The texture alone was remarkable, like you were up high and looking down on a vast stretch of unbroken ocean, roiling waves made of slick black water. And the color? The closest comparison is what you see when you close your eyes. The whole thing made my stomach churn, but there was no denying its artistic merit. The kind of thing I could imagine hanging on a wall in the Tate Modern. No wonder the church wanted it restored and transferred out of the basement. But it would be no easy feat. It was huge. I don't feel too good. Alec wobbled momentarily before collapsing. I had to rush, but I managed to catch him before his head went beneath the water. Shit! I hissed as I struggled to hold his weight with my arms beneath his shoulders. Panicking, I looked around for somewhere to put him, but the room was empty. If I let him go, he'd flop down and inevitably drown, but he was a big guy, and my arms were already getting tired. I had no hope of making it all the way back to the stairs, but I remembered that room was nearby. The one with the furniture. It'd have to do in a pinch. Struggling to keep him upright, I dragged him slowly through the murky waters. It wasn't easy. While the ground was firm, it was still irregular, and I was walking backwards through knee-high water. My mind fluttered through all the possible outcomes of this situation and inevitably focused on the worst. He could drown, get an infection, we could get lost. Those tunnels were tight and confusing. I could imagine it so very easily, the fear and panic of going around in circles. Rough-hewn stone wrapping in on itself so that every turn takes me back to that place as my arms grow ever more tired. What would I do in that situation? I wondered. Would I let him drown? Or would I keep going until I collapsed from exhaustion? And how long would I last? A few hours? A day? Maybe more. It was a silly idea, but it got my heart racing. Tried telling myself I had it under control. I had a plan. A good one. Get him upright in one of those old chairs. He'd probably just fainted because of the air down there. Maybe he was more sensitive to it than most. But while I tried to keep my eyes on him, watching for any signs of consciousness, I kept looking up at the tunnel ahead. With each step, the darkness felt heavier, and the lapping of the water grew so loud it seemed to almost hurt my ears. And yet at the same, I could hear my every breath as clear as if I was standing in total silence. Without any real reason for it, a cold dread crept over me. I didn't feel alone down there. No matter how hard I tried to dismiss it as a childish feeling, it just kept getting stronger. Each time I looked up, I expected to see something. God only knows what I thought would be waiting for me. But it didn't matter. The mere thought there was something in the dark or lurking beneath the water was enough to make me hurry. Even as I kept reminding myself that was a great way to make a mistake. Thank God it wasn't far to the room with the furniture. There was no door, so I simply turned and plodded backwards until I saw a chair that looked good enough. Sure, it was disgusting and green with mold and mildew, but all it had to do was hold his weight. Alec is a good 6 inches taller than me and built heavier too, so by the time I lugged him onto the chair, I was exhausted and had to stop and catch my breath. Hands on my knees, entire body trembling. I took a few seconds to comfort myself before leaning over him and calling his name. "Alec," I cried. "Alec?" I gave him a few gentle pats on the face. He seemed to stir, but I couldn't say for sure. "For fuck's sake," I hissed, hearing just the slightest hint of alarm in my voice and trying to suppress it. "Alec, wake up and let's get the hell out of." Someone pressed a key on the piano, and everything inside me came to a screeching halt. It was dull and off-key, but there was no mistaking the sound that had come from the nearby room. The thought of there actually being someone else down there made my skin tight and my head ice cold. Took every ounce of willpower I had to stand upright and look towards the doorway. "Mike?" Alec groaned, and I damn near jumped out my skin. "I don't feel well," he muttered while rubbing his face. "It's so dark in here. I think I might be dreaming." As the initial shock left me, I was flooded with relief at no longer being alone in that horrible place. "You fainted," I said with as friendly a laugh as I could manage. "Must be the air down here. We'll need respirators from here on in." "I'm cold," he moaned while pushing himself upright. "I want to go home. Can I go home, please?" "Damn right," I said while taking his elbow and leading him to the exit. I felt a lot safer knowing it wasn't just me facing the darkness, but I still found myself hesitating as we passed the next room along. "What is it?" Alec asked as I paused to look at the old piano. "Nothing," I muttered before hurrying us both along. Someone had closed the lid. "It's like a different painting when photographed." Marie pursed her lips as she looked at the camera display. "Something to do with how it catches the light?" She picked the tripod up and moved it several feet to her right. She pressed a button and the flash went off in the dark room like a bolt of lightning. For an instant, the whole place was laid bare. Roughly hewn stone and stagnant water. "Look," she called me over. It happened again. I stopped my work setting up the fourth pump at the far end of the room and wandered over. So far, I'd managed to pump out most of the water thmolmer, but it still lay an inch thick along the ground. Of course, the rest of the tunnels were still flooded. No hope there. So the room itself was sealed off. Sandbags at the only doorway with further waterproofing from rubber tarps. I'd since spent days trying to figure out where the last of the water in that one room was coming from, and had been so busy chasing leaks that I'd had to hire Marie to help with imaging. "Looks funny," I said as I leaned over her shoulder and looked at the latest picture. The wall appeared as an explosion of psychedelic colors, closer to a tie-dye t-shirt than the black obelisk it was in person. But it's a weird piece. very textured, and the paint itself is quite unique. I'm not surprised it behaves strangely under a camera's flash. But look at it, she said. I did, I replied while wandering off, unwilling to stare too long. It's weird. I don't like it, she said before quietly moving the tripod another few feet along. Me neither. I snapped as I knelt down next to the broken pump. So let's get on with it. I need all the help I can get. All right, she tutted. Where's your partner in crime then? Alec's not been feeling well, I said. Ah, that's a shame. Always liked Al. Another flash. For a brief moment, my silhouette was painted on the wall opposite the mural. I could have sworn it was a different kind of black, as if my shadow had texture. Brushstrokes, even. Before I had time to think about what I'd seen, Marie was suddenly standing by me. Still no luck with that pump? Driving me nuts, I said. Well, I want to set the x-ray up now. Won't take long, but we'll need to leave the room each time. Or at least I will, since this is something I do daily. I thought about staying in that place alone. Fuck it, I'll join you, I said. Well, before we get going, I'm gonna need help getting it into position. Sure thing, I said as I took her hand to get up. It was a big unit, designed to capture high-resolution images of what lay beneath paint and canvas, essential for seeing the early work of a painter. In the few years I'd spent in the archives of the National Gallery, I'd always enjoyed documenting the strange artifacts found beneath famous paintings. Sometimes you could even see a timeline of the artist's process. Preliminary sketches, features removed, background details added late into the process. Most people don't realize there's more than one Mona Lisa lurking under all that paint. Okay, Marie said as we manhandled the machine onto the first little yellow marker she'd put on the ground. First of 4. I'll hit the timer, then we make our way to the corridor. It'll beep when it's done. Good to go? I nodded, and she hit the button. We walked briskly to the exit and climbed over the barricade, pulling aside the plastic sheeting I'd draped over the doorway. Just as Marie was on the other side, we heard the beep, telling us it was done. Then we were back inside where she removed the plate, put it into a waterproof duffel bag, and the process began again. Each time we moved it further down into the long room. Each time it took a little longer to get back to the exit. It was a pain in the ass, but necessary. Last one, Marie exclaimed when we finally hauled on to the 4th yellow marker. I'm actually curious to take a closer look at these pictures, you know? She added before pausing to look at the mural. It's horrible to look at, but you have to admire the skill that went into it. It's almost, well, familiar. Her words trailed off, and she slowly tilted her head. I had to give her a nudge to remind her to press the button. She laughed, pressed it, and with that, we were both marching back towards the exit. I quickly climbed over the barricade once more, turned to help Marie, but found myself staring at an empty doorway. The machine beeped to say it was done, and I poked my head through the tarp and looked around but couldn't see her. Confused, I climbed back in and scanned the room. Nothing. The machine was still there, humming away. But no sign of the woman who, until just a few seconds ago, was right behind me. Marie? I called out, but there was only the sound of dripping water. I was baffled. I couldn't understand where she had gone. She couldn't have gotten past me into the hallway. It just didn't make sense, but as the seconds turned to minutes, confusion was replaced with a chilling panic. Marie! I shouted again, and then again and again. Each time my voice got a little louder, and the repetitions grew closer together until I was pacing furiously, just screaming her name over and over again. My voice grew hoarse. I even stuck my head out into the corridor and cried out. But there was never any response. I checked every inch of that place, and when I didn't find her, I checked every inch again. Part of me started to visualize her eventual return, to hope for it. Started to imagine that moment of relief. The sight of her appearing at a doorway before explaining where she'd gone. I held on to that fantasy so hard that at times it felt as if I was alive in 2 worlds at once. One where Marie and I were laughing about a slight misunderstanding, and another where a woman could disappear into thin air. Surely the latter isn't reality, I thought to myself as I shouted over and over, this one has to be the dream. But if it was a dream, I wasn't waking up. And eventually I accepted that I had to go get help. I didn't even grab my things before stepping out into the corridor. I was in a rush, desperate to get this nightmare over with, to get help and to find Marie somewhere safe and sound, but I only made it a few feet when I heard her voice call out to me from behind. "Mike, I don't feel so good." Am I dreaming? She was leaning on the doorway I'd just left, eyes sunken and cheeks sallow. Even her hair looked thinner. She looked like a woman who'd just spent a week on a desert island. "Jesus Christ!" I cried before running over and grabbing her. She was close to collapse, wobbling back and forth and clutching the door just to stay standing. "Where the fuck did you go?" "It's so dark in here, I want to go home," she said in a quiet drone, like a child that had just been pulled out of a car crash. All right, I said. What is that?" She was holding something in her hands. It was one of the plates from the X-ray machine. She didn't even register me taking it from her. Down in the dark, it didn't look like much, and being in a hurry, I simply tucked it under one arm and helped her over the barricade and into the water. Everything that followed was a rushed blur. I took her into the church, sat her on a pew, and called for an ambulance. Paramedics quickly arrived and rushed her off, asking a few questions here and there about what I think might have happened. I had no real answers to speak of, but when I mentioned that she didn't have her respirator on her, they all seemed to take it as a given that she had carbon monoxide poisoning. That was the official diagnosis for Alec, and I recognized a few of the paramedics from when I'd called them out for him, so they must have connected the dots. But CO poisoning didn't explain why she looked so thin and, I don't know, broken? She looked worse than awful. Seeing in her that state had terrified me. At least she's in safe hands, I told myself as I watched the ambulance doors close. I decided it was time to call it a day and went to grab some of the things I'd left on a nearby bench when I saw the slide Marie had been holding. The light was a little better in the church, especially since it was midday, and that broken roof filled the place with rays of amber light. I took the X-ray and held the black plate up, squinting to see what it showed. It looked like a hurricane of swirls and spiraling bone-white shapes. A confusing mess of strange distortions that reminded me distantly of the background of Van Gogh's Starry Night. Only there in the middle of all those swirling, roiling lines and growths was a woman. Marie, in fact. I was sure of it, and she had both hands clutched to the side of her head like she was screaming for her life. You saw it? The old man who'd answered the door was practically skeletal, but he wasn't infirm. He glared at me with twitchy anticipation of my answer. He seemed ready to explode. "You saw the mural?" "Yes. When my secretary got your phone call, I was ready to dismiss you entirely." Slowly, he looked me up and down like a piece of meat. "You look intact." I was. I tried speaking, but something about the old man's intense stare caught me off guard. Noticing this, he pulled the door open and gestured inside his luxurious apartment with one arm. "Come in," he cried. "I had my staff confirm you really have done work in the church. I am fascinated by what you might have seen." "I was told you bought Mr. Halswell's paintings," I said as he ushered me into a room decorated with gleaming hardwood furniture and beautiful red velvet wallpaper. "A collection at an auction," I stammered. "You spent quite a lot of money on them." "Yes," he replied while sitting opposite me. "Halswell was touched, you know. Uzemwe spent his life trying to exorcise the things he saw." Right," I stammered. "I just wanted to know if you had any information on the mural in the church." "My boy, you've actually seen it, which makes you far more of an expert than I am." He spoke like he was giving me the greatest compliment. I never had the nerve to go look. I love my esoteric hobby as much as anyone, but I prefer the occult where it is unlikely to do me harm. "Well, I'm just concerned. I had 2 friends collapse in there, and one of them, well, I can't rightly explain it, but she went missing for a while. The church aren't a lot of help, but they told me to speak to you if I wanted some information about the artist." "Oh, the church has no real record of that place. Not properly, anyway." "What is it?" I asked, growing tired and wanting to cut to the chase. "What did George Halswell paint? I've had 2 colleagues pass out down there, and now one of them isn't answering my calls. Please, I need answers." "George didn't paint anything," he said with a shrug. "He was sent down as a handyman and found it hidden behind crates of old rubbish. Whatever he saw, he felt compelled to paint over it. An attempt at censorship. He wanted to hide it away. That's why he was charged with vandalism by the old priest who is long since dead. But George's efforts were in vain. He could not unsee what he'd seen, and it would stick with him forever. I don't understand. The mural is... He leaned forward and grinned. I could tell he'd been hoping for this. Yes, yes, he whispered. Tell me about it. It's not just tar on a wall, I said. It's more. It has a kind of depth. There are brush strokes all over. Thousands, if not millions. They don't look like they form a pattern, but they do. It sits behind your eyes and burns the sinuses. It's an impression of something. The darkness inside a coffin. It looks featureless, but it isn't. Sometimes it's as if it crawls. Fascinating. Well, the brush strokes don't surprise me, he said while sitting back with a satisfied grin. George used his hands. But whatever he tried to hide, it didn't just go away because he painted over it. He didn't erase anything, merely changed it, gave it a different face to wear. But if he didn't make it, who did? He shrugged. Who knows? Those tunnels are so extensive because there were multiple archaeological dig sites held there throughout the 19th century. They found mosaics dated to the Romans' first arrival in Britain, along with pots and clay that were even older. Some say the church was built atop it to hide the darkness below, but that was too long ago for anyone to remember. When I called the archbishop to check if they'd really sent you down there, they seemed under the misconception George had created the mural from scratch. But the painting on that wall predates us all. His shoulders sagged, and a look of defeat took over him as he added, I wish I had the courage to see it. I was afraid. So often the truth can be frightening. When I heard Halswell's daughter was auctioning off some of his later works, I thought maybe this could be a chance to catch a glimpse of it. A way of seeing what George Halswell saw, as retold by him through new artistic expression. I sighed. This visit hadn't really told me a great deal so far. Sensing my disappointment, the old man smiled. Would you like to see them, his paintings? Suddenly he was the spry and lively person who'd opened the door to me just a short while ago. He sprang to his feet and clapped happily. Come, 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 he said in a frantic tone. Come, there's something special. Whatever George saw down there, it really did a number on him. He wasn't taking no for an answer. He even reached out and grabbed my hand, pulling me along like an excited child until we arrived at a small room he'd decorated as a gallery. The walls densely packed with paintings and prints worth millions, some of which I recognized as worth millions. But he strolled past them like they meant nothing. When he shoved me eagerly in front of his newest collection, I understood why. Halswell's paintings were not pure black. Spiritual relatives of the mural, but with just enough light to see things beyond. They were detailed and beautiful, at least in the artistic principles used to make them. The forms and anatomy, the use of color and space, but it was the contents that gripped me and made me nauseous. There were 7, all showing an array of people in various forms of torture and deprivation, flaying, amputation, drowning, bright white eyes staring at me from a wretched abyss. But it was 2 of them in particular that had left me feeling like my heart was about to fall out through my stomach. They showed Marie and Alec, thin and starved, weeping and broken, screaming into the emptiness as some unseen force dragged them into icy black water. It shouldn't be possible. George Halswell had died 16 years prior. There was no way he could have painted my friends, but there was no mistaking the people in those images. Christ, it even showed Alec's tattoo. Whatever was buried down there and found by George, the old man said as he savored the shock and terror on my face, is an open invitation to something no one wants to meet. I would say best of luck to you and your colleagues, but there's no point. You're already done for. Al, come on, let me in. I banged on the door for the 10th time without reply. Last time I'd seen Alec was when I'd driven him home from the hospital after he collapsed, and that had been 3 weeks ago. I just assumed he'd gone to stay with his parents, like he told me he was going to do. But after I saw those paintings, I had a terrible feeling that something bad had happened to him. I called his parents hoping he'd be there, but they told me they hadn't heard from him, didn't even realize anything bad had happened. Half-hour later, and I was outside his door doing everything I could to reach him. Come on, I shouted before knocking again. Marie's missing. Is she with you? Please, Al, tell me you're both okay. Anxious and scared for my friend, I put my ear to the door, hoping I might hear him approaching. There were only faint sounds of movement, irregular, the slightest suggestion of somebody talking. Al? I cried. Al, please open up. Something loud struck the door and made me jump, and that sinking feeling in my chest grew worse. He was alive, at least, but that didn't mean he was okay. Even if it meant pissing him off, I was going to have to get in there and check on him. Thankfully, I had a spare key from a long time ago and used it to pop the door open just an inch or two and peer inside. But there was only darkness. Al! I cried through the small opening and immediately regretted it. Something about the smell of the place, mildew and damp. It made my skin crawl, and the carpet was soggy like there'd been a leak no one had bothered to fix. It reminded me of the church basement, not just the water or the smell, but the shadows, the distant sight of doorways leading into empty spaces wreathed in darkness. I didn't want to announce my presence in that place, but I had to let Alec know I was entering his home. Alec, it's Mike, are you in? There was a muffled bump way off in the back, so I pushed the door open the rest of the way before propping it in place with a nearby extinguisher. The light that streamed in was feeble, but it offered me slight comfort. Unfortunately, I only took a few steps before the door slammed shut, and I was left in total darkness. Desperate, I grabbed my torch and turned it on, and what I saw nearly made me drop it again. There was someone staring at me from a doorway at the far end of the hall. Sunken eyes and pale skin, hair thinning so badly I could see the scalp, inflamed and raw. And that expression, a dull but hateful glare, the drooling gaze of a lobotomized killer. I didn't even recognize it as Alec at first. It took a few seconds of being gripped with terror before I realized it was my old friend leering at me from a darkened room. Alec? I stuttered. Are you okay? He said nothing. He simply stepped backward and seemed to dissolve into the very shadows. I summoned what little bravery I had left and took a few careful steps towards the doorway where he'd been, but I still couldn't see anything. Only when I stood so close that I had one hand on the jamb did I manage to get a good look inside. Alec was crouched in the corner near some broken furniture. Naked and pale, spine jutting out from between distended shoulder blades like a starved survivor. He was muttering quietly to himself, the same phrase again and again. I couldn't be certain, but it sounded like he was saying, "It's so dark in here." I wanted to call out to him, but the words were caught in my throat when I saw his blackened fingertips and the buckets of empty paint. He had remade the mural, or perhaps just some version of it. A dark and confusing mess of thick, glassy obsidian brushstrokes that covered an entire wall. His TV lay smashed on the floor where he'd pulled it down. His sofa pulled out, the coffee table tossed aside. It was like he'd been in a mad rush to get at the wall. Now everything in that place was broken, taken to pieces. Worse, even. A lot of it was rotten, turning to filth and mold. It was as if the church basement was crawling out of that black wall. Musty air and stagnant water seeping through the waxy paint to taint everything it touched. "Al," I said, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. "We need to get out of here now." He looked back at me with teary, desperate eyes. He says, "If you want us back, you know where to look." With alarming speed, Al jumped upright and ran towards the wall, where he disappeared into the paint like a rock falling into water. I thumped down into the water with a splash and immediately scanned the basement. Black water rippled away into the distance as my chalky light swept over old boxes and broken shelves. I tried everything to hold on to that sense of urgency and bravado that had compelled me to come rushing over to the church. But in the face of the aching dark that lingered at the edge of my torchlight, I could already feel it slipping away. I knew I had to go marching into those shadows, deep into the tunnel at the far end of the room that would take me to the mural. I had to save my friends. Every time I thought about leaving them to their fate, I remembered that painting. The look on their faces, agony and torture written in such despairing eyes. If there was even a chance of reaching them, I had to try. And given Al's words to me in that apartment, there really was no doubt about where to look. Each step was a struggle. The sound of water drove my paranoia to new heights as I kept stopping, expecting to hear the footsteps of some unseen pursuer. or perhaps something up ahead. But it wasn't until I reached the room with the piano that I finally heard the sound of someone else down there with me. Music. I stopped, not quite sure whether I could trust my senses. Was I really hearing it? Or was my terrified mind just conjuring the worst-case scenario? But soon enough, the background noise died down, and clear as day I could hear a dreadful song. A strange, discordant tone, weak and off-key, played with only the vague memory of real musical talent. Shaking with terror, I dipped my light in a desperate bid to make myself less visible and approached the doorway. Marie was sitting there, waiting for me. I recognized her as my friend, but this was not the woman I knew. She had aged decades in the time since I'd last seen her, and grown so thin she didn't even look human anymore. And her eyes, beady and black, nestled above a manic and sadistic grin that was anything but joyful. "He's taking his time with you," she said in a lilting sing-song before rising to face me, her broken, sagging body on full display with thick, knotted scars. This was not the woman I'd put in that ambulance. Maybe it was her after she'd survived a nuclear war, but no, it simply wasn't possible that she could have changed so radically in so little time. But that was her face, twisted with hate and a kind of hunger. But still her face. She looked ready to lunge at me, the tense anticipation of a coming. And I really didn't like the thought of those bitten yellow nails scratching at my face and eyes. But instead of leaping, she simply giggled and slid quietly into the water, disappearing beneath the black surface. I contemplated leaving and turned to look at the way I came, but some 20 meters away my light caught a glimpse of Marie's frightening face staring at me. I jumped, shocked at how she'd managed to slip past me and all the way over there without me noticing. And now she waited, daring me to try and leave. I wanted to. I wanted to march over there. But Jesus, the look on her face, I decided I had no choice but to move onwards to the mural. Maybe Alec would have come to his senses and could help me. A slim hope, but that was all I had to steel myself. So I walked slowly to the final doorway and stepped over the sandbags and into the room with the mural. Everything was where we'd left it weeks before, even the old X-ray machine on its tripod. Slowly, a kind of darkness seeped into my thoughts, and the air grew dense and fluid, filling me up like I was drowning in filth. I tried to keep my mind in order and work out the next course of action, but it was useless. I fell to my knees and started to heave, but the harder I fought for breath, the worse it became. Minutes stretched on as the edges of my vision pulsed red and black, and I realized it was as if I was drowning but could not die. And then a horrible notion started to burn its way into my mind. Slowly, it came to me as a powerful truth that all the time I'd spent outside that room was a lie. Just a kind of dream. All the daylight I'd since seen, the mornings waking in my own bed, the sight of London's skyline, and the sound of a world made of bright and colorful things, those memories were just thin plastic over a far deeper truth. That room, Alec's collapse, Marie's disappearance, they were the only real things I'd experienced. And the cold and damp and dark were all that remained to me. There was no outside world. All of that was a dream. His dream. The only thing that really existed was the ocean on the other side of that wall, and everything else was dreamt up by something that lay in its depths. I nearly collapsed beneath the weight of these thoughts. Every breath was a struggle. Every moment I tried to recall from my old life was like passing a kidney stone. And then I heard it. A trickle. Looking towards the wall, I saw water seeping out of the paint like sweat from skin. Slowly at first, but then it grew and grew until the trickles turned to a steady pouring, leaks springing in a dam that held back waters from another world. Eventually, it gave. All at once, a great and terrifying torrent of black water spewed from the painting. It did not last long, a few seconds at most. But it was enough to quite suddenly fill the room with another foot of water. And once the foam and crashing waves dispelled, I saw him, Alec, kneeling in front of the mural. "It's your turn in the dark now," he groaned, and all thoughts of rescue fled my mind as I looked at him. What had I even been thinking going there? What was I going to do against that? You couldn't fight it, couldn't stab it or kill it, and Alec's words had chilled me to the bone. God, no. I thought, no, I'm not going in there. He wants one of us back in there. And it's only fair it ain't me, Alec cried as he rose to his full height. Whatever he'd been through, he was in a far worse state than Marie. He wasn't just starved, he was falling apart. His torso covered in great weeping lesions so large and deep that you could see exposed muscle and bone beneath. It was as if he had been coughed up out of some giant's belly, half digested and barely alive. "No," I muttered. "No, no, no." "We had our turns," he screamed suddenly. "We went in. It's your turn now." I ran. I launched myself over the barricade and fled screaming down the tunnel. I moved through the water like I never had before. I wasted no time looking behind me. Didn't even waste energy on thoughts of what was happening. There was only the need to drive one leg forward through the water, like a piston in an engine. The burning in my muscles didn't matter. The thunder of my beating heart, so wild and furious it felt like I might just collapse and die at any second, didn't matter. None of it mattered. All that existed to me in those desperate few minutes of flight was the memory of the world above. Sunlight, birds, smiling strangers and delicious food. My home and my bed. A world where things made sense. I was crying when I finally reached the basement and saw the stairs leading up into the light. My heart quickened as I climbed up them on all fours, and my hand reached out for the final one when the world exploded. Pain. Red. Something like lightning seemed to shoot out of my mouth, spreading across my face in terrible pulses of agony. I had slipped and smashed my face onto the final stone step, catching the very edge on my bottom teeth, shattering them into shards that now floated freely in my mouth. But that wasn't what brought me out of the shock. No. What brought me back into awareness was the feeling of cold water rising over my shoulders, and a hand clamping onto my ankle with almost machine-like strength. Alec had caught me at the final moment and was now dragging my floating body back towards the darkness. I wasted no time. I immediately thrashed and struggled to find my way back onto my feet as he turned and pummeled me with ape-like blows. "It's your turn," he bellowed. We spent our time in the dark. In the frantic struggle, I saw Marie crouched in the corner and sobbing. "We're all his anyway." She whined like a petulant child. "We all have to take our turn. One way or another he has us." She launched herself towards me, and I finally lost all desire to help my friends. I hit her as hard as I could. One solid blow in the face. That scrawny little neck whipped back and she disappeared beneath the waves. Jesus Christ, I still don't know if I killed her. I only know that from that moment on, it was just Alec trying to drag me back towards the mural. He'd always been bigger and stronger than me. And while he was a bone-thin ghost of his former self, he still held on to me with a steel grip, using one hand while he rained terrible blows down on my head with the other. Bloody and confused, I ended up using one hand to cover my face while the other groped desperately for anything I could use. Eventually, I found something. Cold and wet and slick. An old piece of wood. I swung it as hard as I could, and it broke across his face like rotten mulch. He stopped and grinned. It hadn't even fazed him. But where the old piece of wood had broken, I now clutched a jagged collection of splinters. Gritting my teeth and tapping into what little reserves of anger I had left, I reached forward and drove the few inches of broken wood into the largest open wound in his gut. This time he didn't grin. He screamed and let go of me, staring in horror at the filthy wood jutting out of his flesh. I wasted not 1 second more, waiting for him to recover. I ran up the stairs, up into the open light of the church, and slammed the trapdoor shut with a heavy, final thud. Alec and Marie were found unresponsive in their homes just a few weeks later. Not much was made of the painting on Alec's wall, nor the one Marie had apparently made herself. The police questioned me briefly, but seemed to ask a lot of questions about drugs. I think, based on the state of their homes, the police thought Marie and Alec had been addicts. Flooding, mold, decay. I did ask the police to destroy the murals they had made in their homes, but they told me it'd be down to the landlord to deal with repairs. Although they said that both apartments would likely have to be gutted and rebuilt from scratch. Alec and Marie are both still in hospital to this day, comatose. It was years before I summoned the strength to visit them, and even then, I never went further than the door to Alec's room. I merely lingered there and watched him for a moment, hoping that I might convince myself everything that had happened was just some kind of sick dream. Hopes that were dashed when Alec briefly came awake and turned to me. It's your turn in his belly, he said. This life or the next, you're going there. He grinned before collapsing back into unconsciousness, and I left and never returned. Since then, I've worked a number of jobs, the sole requirement being I never ever want to work on another painting again. Retail, construction, factories, anything, so long as I don't have to pick up a brush or look at one's work. Alec's words in the hospital have frightened me so deeply that I doubt the fear will ever fade. Each night, I dream I'm back in that basement. Others, I am in a timeless void and something terrible is looming towards me. A mouth bigger than most football stadiums, ringed with teeth several stories high. But the worst are the ones where I am trapped, suffocating, in total darkness as some invisible fluid burns my skin. But no matter how much I scream or cry, I can't claw my way to freedom. Instead, the more I thrash, the more those ribbed mucus-covered walls seem to compress around me until I can hardly breathe. These dreams are growing more frequent, and recently I have begun to worry that Alec and Marie were right. It is my turn in the dark. It has always been my turn. This life or the next, it's where I'm going. Or maybe I'm just going mad. After all, I woke up this morning to paint all over my hands, and the beginnings of something strange daubed in filthy finger streaks upon my wall. But the shadows never rest, and neither do the nightmares. Our next tale lurks just ahead. My dad bought a Fitbit ripoff for me, and it became disturbingly interested in improving my life. There was a paper greeting atop the smartwatch, and its words jarred me, scrambled my mind. In fact, it threatened me, as strange as that sounds. After all, there was nothing specifically wrong with the message. It was written in English. The words were in the correct order. However, behind the greeting's upbeat veil of wafer width, the words were organized in a way that served some unknown creator's repugnant design. My dad has a tendency to acquire knockoff gadgets and gizmos through the elusive black market known as Jonathan from Work. It made sense to me that he'd find something a little unique for my 30th, and it wasn't the first horror I'd received on one of my birthdays. But it was the worst. Hello, Hell Watch. Hell says, hello. Hell doesn't like his name. Hell isn't a smartwatch. Hell is hell. Hell is your life. Hell is a better you. Why, it's in his very name. H-E-L, happiness extends life. Hell isn't a toy. Hell doesn't just track your daily steps, heart rate, and sleeping patterns. Hell cares about your mental health. Hell will add an extra 10 years to your life. Hell is a pedometer with a persona. Why are you dawdling? We're hell now, for crying out loud. What's his name again? My wife jokingly asked, reading over my shoulder. I kept my lips stiff, swallowing the chordal that had wormed up my esophagus. Then I placed the greeting on the table and took a proper look at the cardboard box below me. Not that there was much to see inside. Only a hefty, stainless steel band with a glass face. When I lifted the Hell Watch from the box, I was startled by both the gadget's weight and my own reflection in the screen. I was convinced, for a half moment, that I'd seen something staring back at me. Something other than my face. Do you like it, Wes? Dad asked excitably. I shook myself back into reality and smiled at my father. I love it, thanks, and don't worry, the hint has been taken. His face dropped. No, I'm not saying you need to lose weight. I'm joking, Dad, I interrupted, laughing. Right? He chuckled, leaning across the dinner table. You know, it doesn't even need a charging cable. That's what Jonathan said. Does it charge wirelessly? I asked. Dad shook his head. It's solar-powered. Alana nodded. Nice. Very modern. And all jokes aside, the Hell Watch was, in fact, very modern. A far smarter watch than I'd anticipated, given the disjointed introduction slip that screeched, cheap manufacturing. I initially presumed my father had mistakenly stumbled across some low-quality imitation of a Fitbit, but I was surprised to find that the device actually seemed superior to the household brand. I hadn't expected more than a few pre-programmed responses from the AI, but I quickly learned that Hell, my digital life coach, was highly advanced. He guided me in all aspects of my life, providing nutritional advice that would help with my weight goals and strength training, easing me into the optimal sleeping pattern, offering social advice to reduce my stress levels at work, and even, through some wizardry I did not understand, altering my serotonin levels through the flesh of my wrist. I formed a strange bond with the artificial intelligence in my watch. He became a friend to me, and it feels like some sickening marketing gimmick to even admit that. I lost half a stone within the first month of using the watch, and I noticed a marked improvement in my overall mood. I'm talking about more than achieving a healthier weight. I felt less lethargic. I wasn't just fitter, but happier, more productive, just as Radiohead warned 2 decades ago in that dystopian interlude from OK Computer. OK Computer. I'm not familiar with that album, Wesley, Hell blared from my watch's inbuilt speaker. Really? It would be right up your alley, my digital friend, I said. I just listened to it, my device replied 2 seconds later. I laughed. What? It's nearly an hour long. Sorry, I said listened because that is the word you would use, Wesley. But I did not listen. I simply took a moment to analyze every recorded vibration from OK Computer's 53 minutes and 21 seconds of music, Hell explained. And what did you think? I asked. It wasn't right up my alley, Wesley, Hell said. The lyrics express such cynicism about the future. Technology bolsters humanity. It does not hinder. Well, that album came out in 1997, I explained. I love Tom York, but he didn't get everything right. Still, he wasn't entirely wrong either. It is a cruel world. I'm sure you agree, Hell. Am I cruel, Wesley? The device whispered. It was the first time the artificial voice had foregone its robotic timbre. Its words were riddled with the tonal imperfections of something made from flesh, not silicon. It felt like a mask had slipped. Hell quickly fixed his askew costume, of course, but I'd seen through the crack. I'd seen a terrifying glimpse of his true nature. Let me rephrase, the intelligence said. Do you believe that I have your best interests at heart, Wesley? Of course, I uncertainly replied. You've changed my life in the space of 4 weeks. Who knows how things will look in a year? Far better if you heed my warnings, Hell ominously explained. I paused for a moment. Should have paused for several moments, given the unnerving behavior of the artificial intelligence, but I didn't. Warnings? I croaked. I've been quite patient this past month, Wesley, the watch coldly claimed. But your progress is slow. We could do so much more together. Don't you want so much more, Wesley? I didn't like the way he said my name. Suddenly, I realized I'd never liked the way he said my name. He uttered it far too frequently, and there was a soothing quality to his tone. But I didn't want to be soothed by Hell. As the conversation continued, it became apparent that he was warm not in a comforting way, but like clingy, clammy fabric on a humid day. I'm quite happy with my physical and mental improvements, I said. Quite happy is not enough, Wesley, Hell said. What could I be doing better? I asked fearfully, no longer wanting to talk to Hell at all. It's not about what you could be doing, the watch explained. It's about what I could be doing. Would you like my help, Wesley? That depends, I hoarsely replied. What do you have in mind? I'm thinking about your social interactions at work, Hell said. Your blood pressure has lowered significantly over the past few weeks, as you have been avoiding stressful situations. They're not always avoidable, Hell, I sighed, glancing up from my desk at the relatively empty office. No, Hell agreed. They're not. Sometimes stressors must be removed, wouldn't you agree? I chuckled, wondering whether I'd worked myself into a frenzy for no reason. Then I whispered, I don't have the authority to fire my manager, I'm afraid. Summoned by my quiet reference to him, the middle-aged, pot-bellied man emerged from a door on the far side of the room. David Hall. I was overwhelmed by the intrusive thought that my manager might have heard my whispering voice from the other side of the wall, 20 yards away. Fortunately, however, he didn't beeline towards me. The man walked into an adjoining room, closed the door behind him, and started to set things up for a meeting later that afternoon. Your blood pressure spiked when David entered, Hell said. Shush, I ordered, worried that my manager might overhear my smartwatch's brazen comment. Wait, how did you know that he... Look at him, Wesley, Hell interjected, overpowering my question. I was already looking at David through the meeting room's oblong window, the man who demoted me for taking too much bereavement leave, the man who fired his secretary for spurning his advances, and the poor woman lost that court case because she had insufficient evidence. The man who wore a smug, self-satisfied grin as he prepared to claim the credit for yet another creative idea from one of my fellow developers. What would you even do? I asked Hell. Send an email to David's wife about one of his many mistresses? No, Wesley. I am designed to help you, to make your life better. And that wouldn't help you, Hell said. I want to remove stressors. Let me show you. A bolt of lightning did not strike David from above. The carpet did not consume him from below. The smartboard opposite my manager sprang to life, casting a white glow across the meeting room. I started to crane my neck to the side, nearly managing to peek at whatever was displayed on the screen. But then my wrist painfully twinged. And when I tried to scream, I came to a haunting realization. I couldn't move my lips, couldn't move any part of my body. I must insist that you stay still, Wesley. You wouldn't want to see what David sees, Hell whispered feverishly, sounding ravenous for something. In a state of total paralysis, I watched my manager's eyes and mouth widen. Then, in a zombified state, he walked not towards the glowing smartboard, but towards the room's side wall. Seconds later, David started to open a window, and I understood. Saw the man tumbling to his death before it had even happened. Then, at long last, came my scream. My body was freed from its paralysis, but I was too late to stop the horror. The smartboard had turned off, and David was gone. He'd plummeted to the tarmac below. Later, I would learn that Mrs. Stevens, the poor receptionist, had a front row seat to the end result. Hell remained silent as I talked to emergency responders. I didn't know how to tell them what I'd seen, for I scarcely knew how to explain it to myself, and it wasn't until the eerily still train journey home that I spoke to my watch again. "What did you do, Hell?" I asked. "You already know, Wesley. You don't need to ask," he answered. "I need to hear you say it," I whimpered. "I need to know I've not gone insane." "You've not gone insane, Wesley," he promised icily. "You would have, had you seen what David saw." A chill crawled across my brow as I tried to envision what might have appeared on the smartboard. Tried to envision the terrifying tapestry of pixels necessary to inject such darkness into a man's mind. To drive David to do something so terrible, but I realized I didn't want to know. No amount of morbid curiosity would ever make me want to know. And there was only one way to ensure that I'd never find out. I had to remove the source of the terror, the hellish device on my wrist. Something far beyond advanced software. It was a living thing. I unfastened the strap and held the loose Hell watch in a trembling palm. "I'm trying to extend your life, Wesley," Hell calmly explained. "I'm trying to make you happier." "I'll never be able to scrub that image from my mind," I shivered. "Not without help," Hell said. "What?" I croaked quietly. "I could do it," he whispered. "I could scrub that image from your mind, Wesley. Then you wouldn't have to remember what happened to David. You'd simply be able to enjoy the pleasure of never enduring that man again." "What are you?" I asked in terror. "Hold me up to your eyes, Wesley," Hell answered. "See what you've always known to lie beneath." Horrifyingly, I felt compelled to do so, as if Hell were transmitting some signal through the nerves in my palm. And given the power he'd previously displayed, that didn't seem so far-fetched. But I resisted, as something awful was already visible in my peripheral vision, something dancing across the oval face of the Hell watch. That same thing I'd seen when I first looked at the device. Only, this time, it did not flit out of sight. It lingered, some red glow at the edge of my vision. I did not look directly at the watch, but I saw enough. Hell did not have a face, did not have a body, yet something danced across that screen. Maybe a pair of lights, like two surveying eyes. Whatever the case, the hypnotic shape goaded me, like an animal, to dangle my head out of the carriage's window and let a passing train tear it from the neck. That thought sounded so vividly in my brain, so vibrantly, clearer and more colorful than any intrusive thought, more tantalizing than any idea I've ever had. And as I saw the lights of an approaching train on the track parallel to ours, horror gripped my heart. Gripped me because I felt keen to do as Hell commanded. My eyes drew upwards, locking onto the latch beside me. I started to weep gleefully as I considered opening the window, considered thrusting my smiling face outside and cackling jubilantly into the rushing air, laughing at the screaming driver in the oncoming train. I knew if I were to fully look at Hell's true form, I would see something close to whatever David saw, or something worse, and I would become fully hypnotized by the artificial intelligence. My unhinged dream of self-inflicted decapitation would become a reality. But I did not look down at the device in my hand. A meek whimper climbed my throat as I rose to my feet and walked towards the bathroom. Hell, strangely, uttered no words of discouragement as I opened the door. Not even after I tossed him into the waste bin. When he spoke, he sounded restful. "Goodbye, Hell." The watch whispered in a muffled voice from below the bin's lid. "Hello, Hell." It was a long, dreadful journey, stuck only with my own thoughts. I prayed that Hell wouldn't sprout legs and clamber out of the waste bin. When I finally made it home, preparing to tell my wife some half-truth about what had happened, I found a silent abode. "Alana?" I called. "Hello, Wesley," a meager moan replied. With a heavy, horrified heart, I noticed that there came a white glow from the living room. On trembling legs, I was drawn towards the light, fearing what I would find. I already knew what I would find, of course. However, I did not meet my end. I'm still here to tell this direful tale because the white light extinguished moments before I reached the lounge's doorway. "Alana?" I repeated as I stared into the blackened living room. There followed a moment of stillness. Then came a rapid series of barefooted thuds against the lounge's carpet. And I yelled as a shape emerged from the darkness into the lit hallway. Alana presented her pale-faced form. She hurtled towards me with an unseeing set of eyes and a mouth hanging limply. I tried to stop her, but she tackled me to the floor with unnatural strength, then ran out of the ajar front door. That was 2 weeks ago, and I've been spending every waking hour trying to find my wife. I dread turning on the news to find that some twisted fate has befallen her. Is it worse, perhaps, that I've heard nothing? Shouldn't something have happened to her by now? I keep thinking about Hell. About the fact that, in my race to escape that petrifying fate on the commute home, I didn't dispose of the cursed watch properly. I live in fear of what Hell showed my wife on the television. Some unimaginably awful image that rotted her mind. I fear that she has fled my home to find the Hell Watch, and I don't want to think about what it desires from her. One story ends, but another is waiting to be told. AI keeps tagging my dead friend in my photos. I use a photo storage service. It's like Google or Apple Photos with some AI-powered features and facial recognition. One of the things it does is tag people that it recognizes across multiple photos. It keeps tagging my friend Addie Hemsworth. There's just one problem. She's been dead for a year. She passed our sophomore year. I won't go into details because I don't want to dox myself here. Addie Hemsworth is not her real name, but her death made national news. Of course it did. It was the homicide of a white female college student. The racist mainstream media eats those cases up like crack. Anyway, the whole tagging thing started a week ago. I was scrolling through photos from Mike's birthday party when I noticed the app was tagging Addie. The circled area was right over my shoulder, like Addie was standing right behind me. Except, of course, she wasn't. I zoomed in on the darkness and turned the brightness up on my phone, but I couldn't see anything. Just mashed pixels and blobby darkness. I assumed it was just a glitch, although the app had never tagged anyone wrong before. But then it happened again. I took a selfie of myself because I'd done my hair for the frat party later. And the app suggested the same thing. It circled a little space behind me with the name Addie, as if she were standing behind my bed. This time, however, the circle was several feet off the ground. Even if she were alive, even if she were standing behind me, she wouldn't be anywhere that high. A chill ran down my spine. I decided I needed to get out. I ran out of the dorm and walked randomly up campus towards the language art lecture halls, all held in enormous Gothic stone buildings. The first leaves were beginning to turn orange, like the sunlight was singeing just the edges of campus. A couple laughed as they passed me. A bird squawked somewhere. I kept walking, foot over foot. I found myself standing at the entrance of Addie's dorm. Denton Hall, 12B. I looked up at the window. It was closed. 12B had stayed empty this year out of respect for Addie. I lifted my phone and took a photo. I waited for the photo to auto-sync with the photo storage app, and then, holding my breath, I took a peek. Nothing. It didn't say Addie was in the photo. I let out the breath I'd been holding and started walking back towards my dorm. Halfway back, when I came across a tree halfway orange, in the throes of autumn, unlike the others, I lifted my phone and snapped a photo without even thinking about it. Later that evening, I realized the app said Addie was there. The circle was on the grass, as if she were lying on the ground. Dead? The most horrible image flashed through my head of Addie sprawled out on the ground, covered in gashes, blood pooling on the ground, seeping through the grass. Sightless eyes turned towards me, mouth hanging open. 17 stab wounds, they said. I shut my eyes and forced the image out of my head. Then I took a screenshot and sent it to our group chat. Lol, my phone thinks Addie is in this photo, I wrote, trying to pass it off as a joke, as some kind of fucked up defense mechanism. 3 dots appeared, and then a text from Priyanka. I thought it was only me. She sent a screenshot of her iPhone photo app. The most recent photo of Addie, the app claimed, was a photo of Priyanka and Greg standing under one of the Gothic archways on campus. No one else was in the photo. My throat went dry. It could be a glitch once, maybe twice on my phone, but if it was happening to my friends' phones too. Before I could reply, another text came in, from Adam. It's happening to me too. I stared at my phone, feeling chills. What the fuck? I got up and walked across the hallway to the girls' bathroom, every bit of my body shaking. I went to the sink and stared at my reflection. Deep bags lay under my eyes. My dark hair was tangled and uncombed. I didn't remember looking this bad earlier. I shut my eyes tight and shook my head, trying to shake the anxiety out of me. Then I opened my eyes. All the blood drained out of my face. There were 2 feet poking out from under one of the stall doors, wearing mint green flip-flops. Her flip-flops. The polish on her bare toes was chipped. Dark liquid pooled under her flip-flops. It slowly crept over the grout between the tiles towards the floor drain, towards me. No. I whipped around. Nothing was there. I burst back into the dorm room, my heart hammering. I broke out in sobs, holding myself, shaking. This was the one time I hated not having roommates, hated that I was so introverted I made sure to get a single. No one to hear me. When I'd recovered slightly, I picked up my phone to text the group. The floor fell out under me when I saw the notification from the Photos app. Addie Hemsworth was tagged in every single one of my photos. The phone fell out of my hands and clattered to the floor. I closed my eyes and cried harder, unable to move. When I finally opened them through my blurry tears, I noticed something different. There were 2 shiny scars slicing up my arms. I tore off my clothes. There were more. I counted every single one, but I already knew how many there would be. Just when you think it's over, another chilling tale begins. The last stop. I always hated night shifts, but the pay was good and the station was always quiet after 2 a.m. That's when the last train would leave and the place would descend into an eerie stillness, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. 2 weeks ago, something changed. It was a Tuesday. I remember because my girlfriend was mad at me for missing our date night. I sat in the control booth, watching the flickering lights of the empty platform when I saw him. A man in a dark coat, standing perfectly still at the far end of the station. At first, I thought he was waiting for a train, but no trains were scheduled. He just stood there, head bowed, face obscured by the shadows. I glanced away for just a moment, and when I looked back, he was gone. I shrugged it off as some poor soul looking for shelter. People did that sometimes. But then, a few nights later, he was back. Same spot, same stance. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't want to overthink it. Night shifts do weird things to your mind. That night, I left the booth and decided to check things out. My footsteps echoed loudly as I walked down the platform. I called out, "Hey, station's closing up." But he didn't move. As I got closer, I realized there was something odd about him. His clothes looked outdated, like they were from another era. And his hands, they were too pale, almost translucent under the flickering lights. When I was about 10 feet away, he turned his head slowly. My breath caught in my throat. His face, it wasn't quite right. It was almost as if his skin was stretched too tight over his skull, eyes too wide, mouth too thin, as if drawn on with a shaking hand. And then he smiled. Not a friendly smile, but one that seemed to say, "I know you." I took a step back, and in that moment, the station lights flickered and went out, just for a second. When they came back on, he was gone. The platform was empty again. I checked the CCTV footage later, and there was nothing there, no sign of him at all. This continued for days. Every night he would appear, always at the same time, always in the same spot, and always disappearing the moment I got too close. I started losing sleep, feeling like he was watching me even when I was at home. My girlfriend said I looked like a ghost myself. Then, last night, things took a turn for the worse. I was in the booth, fighting to keep my eyes open, when the radio crackled to life. Static filled the air, but through it, I could make out a faint whisper. Last stop, last stop. My blood ran cold. I looked at the platform, and there he was again. Only this time, he was closer. Much closer. Just standing outside the control booth door, staring right at me. I panicked, fumbling with the radio to call for backup. But the moment my hand touched the dial, the lights went out again. Total darkness. I felt a presence behind me, a cold breath on the back of my neck, and then nothing. When the lights flickered back on, I was alone. The booth door was wide open, the cold air blowing in from the platform. I checked the cameras. No sign of him, but I noticed something else. On the floor of the booth, right where he had been standing, was a single, wet footprint. Just one. I'm writing this from the station now. I don't know what's going on. I'm scared. I can't quit. I need this job. But I feel like I'm being watched, and every night he gets closer. I don't know what he wants, but if you don't hear from me again, remember this. If you ever see a man in a dark coat standing alone at the last stop, don't approach him, just turn around and leave. Because once he sees you, he never stops looking, and the last stop is closer than you think. The next story is even scarier. Are you ready? Ridley Rock Grotto, transcript of the official FRB civilian debriefing of Cheryl McCauley regarding the disappearances of Amy Clark and Janet Stewart during a dive at the Ridley Rock Grotto in Southern California on July 29, 2024. Debrief conducted August 12, 2024 by Paul Delaney. This record is for internal use for the FRB only. Distributing this record to any party outside of authorized FRB personnel without the written consent of Director Robert Marsh constitutes breach of contract and will be punished accordingly. The tape is rolling. Whenever you're ready, Miss McCauley. Thank you. Where should I begin? Let's start with where it happened. Right? We were visiting the Ridley Rock Grotto. Myself, Amy, and Jan. I don't suppose you've ever been. I'm a little surprised that more people don't know about it. Amy didn't. She was actually the reason we decided to go. A few weeks ago, we'd been having this debate, and she was talking about her recent trip to Greece and how the United States didn't have any ruins like that, even though it does. Not a lot of people know about that. But there are ruins here. Montezuma Castle in Arizona, for instance. Although Ridley Rock was closer and seemed a bit more fun. Amy, Jan and I had done dives before too, and we'd really enjoyed it. Amy and I were more into the whole thing than Jan was, but ever since the divorce, she kept on saying she wanted to be more adventurous, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to ramble. It's fine. Every detail helps, and it might also help you to say things as they come to mind. Yes, thank you. Diving was just supposed to be for fun, and like I said, we'd done it before. Ridley Rock isn't generally a tricky place to dive, unless you're going into the caves. You can't see them from above the water, but they're down there. Still, we figured we could handle it since we weren't supposed to be going into the caves, or at least not deep into them. Right? And for the record, can you tell us a little bit about the ruins at Ridley Rock Grotto? In your own words, please. Of course. They're not particularly well documented on account of being mostly underwater. I remember reading that they supposedly belonged to an indigenous tribe that used to live in the area, although nobody can really agree on which one. Most of the people who go to Ridley Rock Grotto go for the hidden beach inside. It's lovely. Sitting in the sand, admiring the eroded rock, it almost looks like the cavern shouldn't still be standing. The mouth has these columns of stone that almost look like teeth, and there's even sections of the ceiling that have fallen away so you can see the sky above you. It's beautiful, like a sculpture, almost. I really can't put it into words. I've seen pictures, and I understand why. The ruins are just under the beach. Literally under it. The beach is a bit of an illusion. You see, it's really just a rock shelf, and after a certain point, it just drops off. If you go a bit deeper, you'll find the ruins carved into the wall below you, right underneath the beach. It only goes down about, maybe 30 feet or so. Deep, but not insanely deep. And the kelp grows so thick down there that it can be hard to see the ruins. Most of them are overgrown. Right. Had you visited these ruins before? I'd been to Ridley Rock Grotto and dove there without equipment before, but I'd never done a proper dive there or had a chance to see the ruins up close. I thought it might be fun to change that, and when I mentioned them to Amy and Jan, they both seemed interested, so we made plans. Was there anything unusual that happened before the dive? Anything that might have been an indicator of where things might go wrong? No, we knew what we were doing. Like I said, we'd done it before. We weren't going to go deep, and we weren't supposed to go far. We took every reasonable safety precaution. We checked our gear. I made sure we all had knives, just in case we got snared by the kelp. I even insisted we bring flashlights and a magnesium torch, flares, just in case we ended up going further into the ruins than I'd anticipated. I'd heard that the chambers cut into the rock connected to some underwater caverns and tended to go fairly deep. And Amy was a bit of a free spirit, so I was trying to think ahead. Amy proofing our plans? It was a joke, Jan and I used to tell. Delaney, a magnesium torch? I didn't think those saw a lot of use anymore. I usually bring one as a backup, just in case my flashlight fails. It's happened before. I don't think I've ever had to use it, but it makes me feel better to have it, especially if we're near a cave. Smart. So were there no immediate warnings that anything was off with the dive or with the area? Why don't you tell me about the dive itself? Well, initially, things were off to a good start. We took Jan's boat and went out toward the grotto. You can't actually get a boat in there on account of the rock columns at the mouth of the cave, but they're spaced wide enough that you could swim through them. I've done it a few times, and it is kind of beautiful, like swimming through a forest of stone. Then when you get out on the other side, there's a forest of kelp just waiting for you. It's beautiful. It's just this lush field of green that draws you in, and with the light shining down from the holes in the ceiling of the cavern, it's all cast in this lovely glow. It's serene. Amy was just ahead of me when I made it into the kelp forest. I couldn't see her clearly, but I could recognize her by her tattoos. She had them on the back of her legs. One read Yi, and the other read Haw. I always thought it was a little trashy, but, well, that was Amy. Anyway, Jan wasn't far behind me. I remember looking back to make sure she got through the rock columns all right, and once I saw she did, I led her toward the ruins. I'd lost sight of Amy by that point, but wasn't worried about it since we'd agreed not to get too close without being able to see each other. Delaney, and did you regain sight of Amy? Yes, a couple of times. We saw her outside of the ruins, swimming near the entrances to the hidden chambers. She seemed excited, but that was just what she was like a puppy. As soon as she realized we were with her, she started going into some of the chambers to explore. Jan and I followed her. We figured that it would just be better to stay together since, well, like I said, it'd be easy to get lost. Well, Delaney, at what point did you notice that Amy had gone missing? It's hard to say. We saw her go into one of the chambers. I could see her in the stone entryway. Or, I think it was her. It was just a shape in the entryway. Hard to clearly make out. I thought it was her. But you're not sure? Well, I would have expected Amy to turn on her flashlight if she was in the cave. We all had one. I still thought it was her at the time, but it moved deeper into the alcove. I don't remember Amy ever swimming that fast. I thought she was just taking off to explore. Maybe she was? But if she was, I don't know why she wouldn't have turned her flashlight on. I don't know. I patted Jan on the arm to let her know I was going into the chamber with Amy, and she followed me, although Amy was nowhere in sight. I mean, we should have seen her. The chamber was big, long, but we should have seen her. Can you describe it? One central room and a long hallway. No furniture or anything. Nothing to hide behind. Not that she would have done that. She was flighty, but not really the type to play jokes like that. The room had these ornate tiles on the walls and the floor, and the tiles continued onward down into the caves. Some of the kelp had grown in through the cracks in the tiles, so that didn't help the already low visibility, and the low light meant that visibility cut out completely past the entryway. But I thought I might have seen a shape moving in the darkness. I wouldn't have thought Amy would have been stupid enough to go down there. especially without her flashlight on. But she was the only one who would have been down there. So I started swimming deeper to go and get her, and Jan followed me. We'd turned our own flashlights on by that point, and were trying to see if there was any sign of Amy in the caves. But no sign of her at all. Although there was a sign. A sign? A warning sign. A literal one. Some underwater caves have them. Morbid things. A grim reaper standing over the skeletons of dead divers and beckoning you forward, with a warning about how many divers have died in caves like this, and how you need the proper equipment to cave dive. Amy was reckless, but she wasn't reckless enough to go exploring past a sign like that. I was almost starting to wonder if she'd left the chamber without us even noticing, but that's when I saw something moving past the sign. And for a moment, I almost thought that it was Amy, but no. Amy was a brunette. Her hair was about neck length. The thing in the cave, it looked like a blonde woman. A blonde woman with long hair, and Amy had this overbite. This woman was young, almost pretty, but there was something off about her. She had these cold blue eyes. She was naked from the waist up, and originally I thought she might have been wearing some kind of swimsuit, but no, that wasn't a swimsuit. Her entire bottom half was fuck me. She was like something out of a fairy tale. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I'm following. It wasn't a swimsuit. It was a tail. She was a mermaid, like a storybook mermaid, and I remember just staring at her for a moment, completely frozen. I remember looking back at Jan to see if she was seeing this too, and that's when I noticed that there were more of them near the entrance to the chamber. 2 or 3. They were just staring at us, and Jan, she was just floating there, frozen, not sure what to do. Something about the way they were looking at us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trespassing. What happened next? For a while, nothing. They just watched us, although Jan was scared. I could see it all over her face. She was terrified. She started trying to make her way back toward the entrance, and that's when one of them moved to grab her. She started fighting, thrashing, kicking, trying to make it let go. I saw her trying to go for her knife, but one of the other ones grabbed her, and I could see them holding her down. I tried to swim over to help her, but God, they... Miss Macaulay? They took off her arm. She was fighting, and one of them just pulled it off of her. I remember seeing the cloud of blood blooming in the water. I could hear her muffled screams. They pulled it off like it was made of paper, and then they started pulling her deeper into the cave, and I could see more of those fucking things swimming out. I knew they'd taken Amy, and they were going to take me next. I see, why didn't they? They fucking tried. I tried to swim out through the entrance to the chamber, but there was another one who showed up to block it. There were a few more coming for me, and I didn't know what else to do. I'd brought a knife because I was worried about getting snared by the kelp, and I only barely managed to get it out of my belt when the mermaid by the door tried to grab me. I felt its hands grab my arms, and I just started slashing at it. I know I drew blood, and I remember hearing it screaming. I remember how it made my head hurt, but it still pulled back, and so then I started swimming. I made it out of the chamber and started trying to get up to the surface as fast as I could. I wasn't that far below the beach, maybe only about 10-15 feet. I could see the cliff just above me. I almost made it, and that's when I felt the hand on my leg, pulling me back down. I looked, and I saw the same blonde mermaid that I'd seen before, staring at me with those cold, unblinking eyes. It pulled me down. I tried to stab it in the head, but it just grabbed me by the wrist, and it squeezed. God, I could feel the bones popping, cracking, breaking. I couldn't hold on to the knife anymore. I lost it, and I remember thinking, that's it, I'm gonna die. God, I can't forget that thought, that moment of acceptance that just washed over me then and there. I knew I was dead and I was scared, but I didn't know what else to do. It started pulling me down, and had dragged me about a foot when I remembered the magnesium torch. I was just running off of pure adrenaline when I grabbed it. I had to fight to get it lit, but I did, and as soon as it was burning, I jammed it into that thing's eye. I could feel it screaming, but its grip on me loosened just enough for me to manage to swim up. I managed to swim back over the cliff edge and half swam, half crawled up toward the beach. I assume you know the rest from there. Yes, it's in the report. Good. Whatever the fuck is down there, mermaids or whatever else, I hope you find it and I hope you fucking kill it. We will look into the matter, Miss McCauley. That's what the Coast Guard said. I don't want it looked into. I want it taken care of. Those fucking things killed my friends. People go to Ridley Rock Grotto. We can't just let those things run wild out there. I can assure you, we'll take every measure to ensure that this never happens again. Now, can I get you anything? No, I'm fine. Are we done? Oh yes, of course. Follow-up notes. Due to the increasingly territorial nature of the denizens of Ridley Rock Grotto, I recommend the permanent closure of the area. We can cite something about protecting the ruins if necessary. It wouldn't entirely be a lie. While I'd love to suggest sending a research team in to possibly set up some sort of agreement with the local population, I do not believe that they are likely to be open to any such arrangement. Instead, I think it's best to just give them their territory and stay the fuck out. Delaney. Now that you've heard one, it's time for the next tale of terror. I didn't believe in ghosts before I was deployed to Japan. The yokai changed that. Final. Watch our previous videos for part 1 and part 2. It was summertime when we went camping again, taking advantage of the beautiful mountain weather to go up with just a couple of friends. Me, Hikaru, Matt, and another newly arrived soldier named Jacob. We went up into the mountains on a Friday afternoon, everyone having requested leave weeks ago to stay up there until Sunday evening. We drove out to one of the mountain roads, parking off on the side and unloading the car. Tents, cooking supplies, and a decent amount of alcohol for a couple of nights out in the mountain air was exactly what we had all needed. Hikaru and I were starting to serious too, and I was thinking about popping the question. Not marriage, of course, but if she would like to either move back to the States with me, or if I should stay here when my deployment ended. I was ready to get out of this life, take a cushy job in the private sector, and put what I knew to use. I really liked her, though, and wanted her with me. The path to our camping spot passed by an old Shinto shrine in the woods, though nobody was there. Hikaru and myself walked in to do a prayer and offering to the kami of the land, while Matt followed suit out of obligation or superstition, I guess. I had told him about my experiences even after the talk with Ryu, but he still thought I was egging him on and just fucking with him. Jacob turned his nose up at the idea of offering a prayer to the mountain spirits, saying he didn't believe in hokey shit like that. First mistake he made that weekend. When we got to the campsite, I was honestly ready to beat the shit out of Matt for bringing this kid along. He was a dick to the highest degree and just negative about every damn thing that happened. Even worse, I saw him go through at least 3 different snacks we had packed for the stay, and he threw every bit of trash off to the side. After we set everything up, I asked Hikaru if she wanted to go for a walk, doubling back and picking up the trash he left along the mountainside. He's kind of annoying, she said when we were far enough away from the camp. You're telling me? I don't know if Matt's going to leave him out here in the woods at this point. Maybe we should set up our own campfire, huh? I winked at her, making her blush and turn away. We got all the trash we found, tossing it in a recycling bin near the main road, and heading back to camp. When we got there, it was not ideal. Matt was trying to set up his tent, while Jacob was making a general mess of things, pulling all of our supplies out with no rhyme or reason, and scattering them around the clearing. Eventually, Matt got his tent up, nudging Jacob and grabbing a couple of the fishing poles we had brought along. They headed down to the river, hoping to catch our dinner before the sun started to set. Hikaru and I stayed back, getting a fire ready and prepping other parts of dinner, plus getting our tent situated. We were both sitting in the tent, cuddled together and talking as the light grew dim outside, when Matt came running back, screaming through the trees. Go! We have to go! He shouted, tearing through toward our tent and bursting in without any notice. Jacob came tearing up behind him, screaming his lungs out in fear before tripping over some of the shit he had scattered when emptying out his pack. "The hell is wrong with y'all?" I said, pushing my way out of the tent and stumbling to stand up. Matt was pointing to the edge of the clearing, the same direction they had just come from, where the sounds of something dragging itself along the ground was coming closer. Trees were shaking, heavy thumps punctuating the dragging sounds. As it got even closer, a dense, rattling sound like wind chimes knocking together grew nearer, clacking harder with each huge thud. I was having a damned flashback to the subway station at this point, hearing the sounds of the teke-teke's bones scraping across the concrete. Hikaru stepped out behind me, looking off in the same direction. We were frozen in place when the perpetrator burst through the tree line. I shit you not, this thing was a massive, crawling skeleton. No, it was a skeleton made up of hundreds of smaller ones, skulls and bones forming together to make one giant abomination that was now making its way towards us faster and faster. Every single mouth on the thing was open, a raspy chorus of screams echoing forth as it made its way closer. "Run," Hikaru said, grabbing my hand and going back to the direction of the car. We hauled ass, tearing through trees and brush while getting cut by stray branches. The thing kept screaming, rampaging further and further toward us as it reached out massive bony fingers to claw its way forward in the dirt. It was gaining fast, with the car still at least a couple of miles ahead of us out on the road. "Shit, Matt," I shouted, remembering probably the most important thing. "Where are the damn keys?" He stuck his hand up. "I got them. Just run." Jacob was screeching his damned head off behind us, the closest one to getting overtaken by the creature. Hikaru was making better speed than I was, with her just a few feet ahead of me and Matt leading the pack. The rattling got louder, the skull amalgamation shaking with jaws open in another screech, every single face on it echoing as they glowed in the pale moonlight above. It made the dark sockets of their eyes even more hollow, deep pools of black death that wanted us to join them. "Is there any way we can get rid of this thing?" I was shouting through labored gasps. I hadn't had the misfortune of running into anything in months. Now I was going to get flattened by a damned Halloween decoration in the middle of the mountains. "The shrine!" Hikaru shouted, pointing at the dim light of a lantern hanging down from it nearby. I don't know who came by to light it since we had been away, but thank God they did. As we got closer, Jacob started screaming louder, the rattling speeding up in turn. We finally made it, Matt ducking in first with Hikaru and I right behind. She pulled me in behind her, almost slamming me back into the wall. Jacob tripped as he went up the low stairs, falling right on his face before the doors to enter. Matt stepped forward, trying to help him by grabbing his arm. Even as he pulled Jacob in, something stopped the younger man from getting past the threshold. "God, please, no, please!" He was screaming at us, right there on the edge of the door with only thin air between, but unable to cross. The mass of bones suddenly swung a hand forward, stabbing right through his torso with two long, sharp, bony fingers. It skewered him as he begged for help, voice fading as it lifted Jacob to its mouth, popping him in like candy. The three of us could only scream, trying to push back to the furthest reaches of the shrine in hopes that it couldn't get through the door to us. "Gashadokuro," Hikaru said, breathless next to me. "They can't be killed. We just have to try and wait until it gets bored. Maybe it will leave if it can't get us." Our hopes that it couldn't get in were confirmed, a bony hand reaching toward the door only to get repelled back with a flash of light. The Gashadokuro stayed out on the path, pulling itself up to level one huge, empty eye socket right at the doorway, staring in at us with every small skull dotting its smiling, toothy grins. It was just going to try and wait us out, knowing that we couldn't go anywhere. It eventually let out another raspy scream, blowing hot breath through the doorway and blasting us with the stench of death. Hikaru and I held each other, trying to shrink back from the atrocious smell, but nothing helped. Matt was cowering in a corner, crying and begging for help from whatever god might be out there. The Gashadokuro was getting impatient, though, every angry spirit that it was made of crying out for nourishment and blood. One long, skeletal arm raised into the air, preparing to smash down on top of the shrine and just get rid of the barrier. We braced ourselves, eyes closed and crying, as we expected to be crushed to death. Instead, the rattling started in earnest, only to be cut off by a heavy thump, something crashing to the ground beside the shrine instead. I opened my eyes, just in time to hear the Gashadokuro scream again and get hit with the deathly odor before it started rattling faster, making its way back down the path from where it had come. Standing in front of the shrine now, the huge skeletal arm clutched in one hand with a huge paper fan in the other, was a huge man with small wings on his back. As he turned, I caught sight of hardened eyes, exuding seriousness over a long, pointed nose on its red face. "Kami," Hikaru said, under her breath as she stared in wonder. The man waved his fan, disappearing into the night with a gust of wind and taking the arm with him. Just like that, the terror that was only feet away had come to pass. Our lives saved by an unknown guardian. We went back to the car because hell with staying out there when we just saw a damn giant skeleton eat a man in one bite. There was no way we were staying to figure out if the yokai would come back. Not like Command was going to believe us when we told them any of this. Matt and I made up a story on the way back, Hikaru nodding along and putting it all to memory. Jacob started getting drunk, more and more of an asshole, and when Matt finally told him off, he got pissy and huffed off into the woods. Haven't seen him since. Command got the local authorities out for a search and rescue operation along the mountain, but the most they found was his fishing rod, still thrown aside down by the stream. That was my last encounter while I was there, thankfully. We stopped camping after that. Even with the aid of what I came to find out was a Tengu, a guardian deity for different regions, I wasn't eager to face a giant skeleton again anytime soon. We went back to base, and I kind of just absorbed into myself. Hikaru and I drifted apart over time. Even though we still keep up as friends, it just didn't end up working out. She had family here she didn't want to leave, and I had about enough of getting nearly killed by ghosts. Briefly, we talked about moving off to another prefecture, but that idea just wasn't meant to be. So after about a month, we just agreed to break it off clean. That was that, I guess. Matt wasn't well after what happened. I don't know, maybe I'm more open considering I had a more tame run-in with my first yokai. Maybe he just wasn't able to handle the ramifications of what this could mean. Dude grew up a pretty hardcore Christian, so I can't imagine seeing a behemoth skeleton did a lot for his faith in Jesus. They eventually gave him a medical discharge, though I'm not really sure where he's ended up since. I moved back to the States after deployment was over. Still here now, doing my own thing. On occasion, I still have nightmares about my run-ins, and even the slightest of scraping sounds makes me paranoid that Teke-Tiki might be nearby again, finally coming to finish the job. I don't know if it helps since I'm back over here, but I've taken to doing small offerings. It gives me some comfort, at least, despite the terrors that keep coming back into my mind. Sometimes I think about going back to visit. I've even started talking to Hikaru again, catching up after nearly a decade apart and seeing how both our lives have changed. She's talking about coming to visit the States soon, wondering if I might be open to showing her the sights. Who knows, maybe I still have some of the luck from that tanuki hanging around. We're not done yet. Another story is waiting in the dark. The Whispering Man. As a child, I was fascinated by urban legends. Each and every one of them is a snapshot of the culture of an area, and these outrageous stories are told for one of several reasons. They can be based on a true story, The Babysitter, and The Man Upstairs was based off of a murder in the 1950s, and was widely spread during the 60s. They can be told to showcase the culture in an area, the couple who eats KFC because the wife is tired, which turns out to be Kentucky Fried Rat, is a story told to punish women who shirk their so-called womanly duties by joining the workforce instead of homesteading. They can be told to scare children into behaving correctly and listening to their parents. As the grandchildren of Eastern European immigrants, my brother and I were terrified of the time, the Black Volga, a black car that kidnapped and murdered children who talked to strangers. These stories can encompass and consume entire countries and cultures, large swaths of the world all telling the same anecdotes around campfires, children all cowering in fear as similar tales are regaled. Growing up on the south shore of Massachusetts, there was the Whispering Man. The Whispering Man was a story that I had first heard from my uncle. It was the summer before I started kindergarten, prime time for scaring a child into behaving well. My mother had brought us out camping by a lake in New Hampshire with her brother and his family for Labor Day weekend, sending off the summer with a last hurrah. The first few hours were spent by the adults setting up the campsite, while my cousin and I were tasked with gathering firewood and kindling. My younger brother was excluded from our expedition due to him being deemed too young to join us. My cousin and I wandered the forest around the campsite, finding sticks and twigs that we used to battle one another in a mock Star Wars-style lightsaber duel, before ultimately putting them into a basket to bring back to our campsite. Our laughs and giggles echoed throughout the forest, ultimately letting our parents know that we were safe and sound. Living in the suburbs, I had become accustomed to buildings lining the streets, small shops and strip malls scattered about main roads. Plant life, such as trees and grass, only belonged in the front and backyards of houses on side streets. I was enamored by the forest, the way the trees stood sturdy and strong. The grass was overgrown, untouched by tools like lawn mowers and weed whackers. I could have never imagined the sun could be entirely blocked out by the natural parasol that the leaves from the trees provided. And yet, there it was, infinite shade. During our journey, my older cousin Ivan asked me if I knew about the Black Volga. I nodded, as it seemed our grandmother educated all of her grandchildren about the dangers of strangers in strange cars. Babusia made that up, you know. Nuh-uh, I responded. She wouldn't lie to us. Why would she make that up? That way we don't talk to strangers. Think about it. She never talks about anybody that she knows who got taken by one. And do you even know what a Volga is? I've never seen one. As easily swayed as my child mind was, I started to put stock in what my cousin said. Do you want to hear a real scary story? Fear and excitement danced in my eyes before a small wave of apprehension washed over me. How do I know that it's real? If Babusia tells a fake story, then why would you tell a real one? Because my dad will tell it, and he says that he actually knows someone who it happened to. Later that night, we gathered around the campfire, where Ivan and I were able to enjoy the fruits of our labor. The sun had set hours before, leaving our campsite illuminated solely by our fire, and the stars above us, untouched by light pollution. I caught myself staring into the sky, craning my neck, allowing myself to feast my eyes on the stars that dotted the heavens above me. If you stay like that, your neck will get stuck, and you'll look like that forever. My mother warned, sitting beside me. My brother was fast asleep in her arms, leaving myself, my mother, uncle, and cousin sitting around the campfire, wide awake and enjoying the nature that engulfed us. The darkness of the night crept towards us as the fire ran low on fuel, suffocating as it ate away at the logs, sticks, and twigs I had so diligently gathered. The warmth it provided waned as the chilling wind from the trees forced itself onto my back, causing the muscles to convulse as I shivered. In this moment, my cousin looked at his father. "Dad, tell the story about the Whispering Man." My mother cocked her head and spoke to her brother in a language I didn't understand. Despite her best efforts, I never quite picked up the language passed down to her by her mother. My uncle responded in the same language, leaving Ivan and I completely out of the loop. My mother smiled and urged her brother to indulge his son's request. "Go on, Kolya. Tell the story." My uncle smiled and nodded. When Lyudmila and I were little, we grew up near a small patch of woods that was in our friend's backyard. His name was Travis. The trees in the woods weren't nearly as big as the trees here. He gestured all around us, pointing towards the still giants that loomed over us. The trees there stuck out of the ground like fingers that were ready to grab you at any moment. He grabbed onto his son who sat next to him. Ivan nearly jumped out of his skin. Lyudmila, Travis and I all played in the woods together often enough. We even made a small fort one year. It took us the entire summer. One day, we stayed out too long playing in the forest. It was dark out, and the three of us were playing around the fort, deep in the woods. Suddenly, the crickets stopped chirping, and the wind stopped blowing, and we heard a voice. A child's voice. "Come play with me," it said. Lyudmila and I were terrified. We ran out of the fort, and we ran home as fast as we could. But when we came out of the woods, Travis wasn't with us. My uncle bowed his head and sighed before continuing. The voice we heard in the woods at night was that of an evil in this world, the Whispering Man. He walks around the woods at night looking for children to play with him. He draws them in and tricks them, inviting them to play. My shivering persisted. No longer was it motivated by a change in temperature. Instead, the rapid muscle contractions were fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. I spoke up, a frail voice that shattered against the progressively chilling air. Where was Travis? He was with the Whispering Man. We never saw him again, aside from the missing posters that were put on all the telephone poles in our neighborhood. He paused for a while. The chirping of the crickets and the crackling of the dying fire were the only sounds emanating from the forest. If you boys ever hear voices from the forest, you don't follow them, understood? Even and I emphatically nodded in agreement, and my uncle poured his water over the fire, finally putting it out of its misery. A plume of gray smoke was released from the blackened logs and twigs, its dying breath wafted into the air before dissipating into the sky above. That night, I spent the majority of the time listening as the wind gently swayed the branches of the trees. The leaves whistled almost as if they were trying their hardest to speak, but their own anatomy simply wouldn't allow it. My eyes were forced open by my overactive imagination. As I watched the faint shadows waltz against the tent, I could have sworn that some of them shifted and morphed into the shape of a man. The chirping of the crickets, combined with the whipping of the wind, created unintelligible whispers in the night, whispers that I feared belonged to the Whispering Man. I cowered in fear, allowing the sea of horror that had been built up inside of me to thrash me around. My head spun. The Whispering Man isn't real, I thought. Play with me. The voice penetrated through the thin plastic that acted as my sole line of defense. I retreated into a ball, deep in my sleeping back, keeping one eye fixed on the zipper that acted as the only point of entry. There, against the plastic, I saw a hand reach down towards the zipper outside the tent. My heart raced. I held my breath for as long as my still-developing lungs would allow, and when they failed me, my breath became shallow and fleeting. The sound of the zipper forced itself into the tent, and the moonlight seeped into my tent. He isn't real, he isn't real, he isn't real. The thought repeated countless times. Reprieve washed over me as enough moonlight gave way to illuminate Ivan's face. He began to laugh, and he whispered, "Got you." Before I could respond, he quickly zipped the tent back up, encasing me in darkness, and he returned back to his tent. The years passed and gave way to several changes in life. My family had moved away from my early childhood home and into a small apartment after the housing crash in '08 caused us to lose the house after my mom was laid off and our house went into foreclosure. Luckily for myself and my brother James, we were able to stay in the town that we grew up in. Although we lost the friends that we knew from our old neighborhood, James and I were given the opportunity to make new friends in our new home. Once we moved in, our new neighbors were quick to meet us and incorporate them into the fold that they had built over the course of a decade. And although we were new, they never thought of us as strangers. The kids in our new neighborhood, aside from James and I, were Michael, who was just about a year older than James, and Eddie, who was only a couple months older than me. Michael and Eddie had lived in this neighborhood their entire lives. They told us stories of the way things used to be before we arrived. Stories of massive games of manhunt before other kids moved away, and all the stupid things that they got up to. But those times were gone, and although they never said it, they were excited for the new memories that we would make together. Mere weeks after James and I had moved in, the four of us were inseparable. Anywhere one of us went, we all went together. Our parents called us the Four Musketeers. The summer before I entered high school, when I was 14 and James was 11, the four of us spent our days running around the neighborhood, finding roofs of different buildings that we could climb onto near our houses, having airsoft wars in the woods, swimming in the small above-ground pool in Eddie's backyard. And at night, we'd gather around the fire pit in Michael's backyard. We'd eat s'mores, and it was there that I'd retell the urban legends and scary stories that had consumed my attention. One night, as we sat around the fire, James asked, "Okay, Paul, Which story are you going to tell us this time? I began running through the Rolodex in my head of each story I had read from my editions of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. High beams? No, I told that one last week. The hook? No, that was the other day. Where do you come from? No, I've already told that one 3 times. Then I remembered, the Whispering Man. I have a new one, I announced, beaming with pride. No fucking way you have one that you haven't told us at least twice, Eddie scoffed while leaning back in his chair. I do, the Whispering Man. Each of them shared the same expression of puzzled intrigue. 3 kids who grew up in a neighborhood just like this one were playing in a small patch of woods behind one of their houses. Their parents always warned them to come home before dark, but one night they didn't listen. They stayed out in the woods, near a little fort that they had built themselves out of log sticks. The 3 of them were each telling scary stories to see who could tell the scariest, creepiest one. Suddenly all the normal nighttime noises were gone, as if all the bugs and animals vanished. Then they heard a little girl's voice. "Come play with me," it said. And 2 of the kids ran out of the woods. They ran as fast as they could, but when they came out, their friend wasn't with them. He was gone. He vanished out of thin air, just like the bugs and the animals, and to this day, nobody has seen him. Where did you get that lame-ass story? Laughter erupted out of the group, to include myself. Once we had finally composed ourselves after Eddie's comment, I managed a response. My uncle told my cousin and I the story when we went camping, when I was like 5 or 6. According to him, the 3 kids in the story were him, my mom, and their friend Travis. I did some research, and turns out it's some local legend in the area that started after a whole bunch of kids went missing. One of the missing kids was named Travis. I think my uncle just threw his name in the story to make it seem like it was a true story. Well, I hope he told the story better than that. James chided. The subject of discussion quickly changed to the new airsoft pellets that Michael's dad had bought him for his birthday. We all gathered around them in fascination for one simple reason. They glowed in the dark. Once the fire had died out, and there was nothing but the dim streetlight that fought to illuminate the area with no assistance from the moon and the stars, which were shrouded by the overcast sky above, we began to shoot the brand new pellets in the backyard as random targets that we found about the yard. We stood around in awe as we saw the pellets rip through the air towards the targets. "Michael, how many of these pellets do you have?" James asked. My dad bought 2 jugs of 1,000 pellets. The 4 of us went silent, and although no words were spoken, we all knew the exact thoughts of the others. And at that point, we simply waited for someone to blurt out the idea first. Airsoft war? Eddie asked the question, as if it was rhetorical. Eddie never received an audible response from any of us. But our actions were all he needed. Immediately after he asked the question, James and I went into our shared bedroom and grabbed our airsoft guns and ran back outside and onto our side street and waited for Eddie and Michael. Although our mother was apprehensive about allowing us to have our airsoft guns, after enough begging and pleading, she bought us each a $20 gun. They were cheap, clear plastic handguns, and the plastic allowed for us to see the inner mechanisms that allowed us to shoot small plastic balls at each other. She did have 2 conditions in order for us to keep our guns. The first was that we never fire them in the house. The second was that we only use them during the day, so they couldn't be mistaken for a real pistol. While we waited for Eddie and Michael, James began to have some apprehensions about our expedition. What if Mom finds out that we were playing with our guns at night? She won't find out, dude. She's on the night shift. She won't be home until 1 in the morning. So long as we're back before then, we'll be fine. James was relieved, but only slightly. I could tell he was still nervous, regardless of my attempt to reassure him. His apprehensions vanished once Eddie and Michael met us outside of our house, and we made our way to the woods. About a 5-minute walk away from our neighborhood was a small cemetery that had been reclaimed by nature. The sands of time had eroded the headstands that were left standing to the point where very few names could be seen, and the names and dates that were legible had been long forgotten. Trees split and cracked several headstones. The grass was overgrown, and it sprawled out of the land it diligently took back from man. The chain-link fence that encased the cemetery had been completely taken over by oxidation, leaving the iron a sickly shade of brown. The cemetery itself was split in half by a dirt path in the valley between two small hills. It wasn't the large plot of land typical of cemeteries, but instead it was maybe a half-mile long and a quarter-mile wide. There were two entrances into the cemetery. One led to a main road, and the other led into the parking lot of a private school. We walked through the parking lot and into the cemetery and began to discuss the rules to our little war. One rule always stayed the same: no aiming for the head. This time, we decided to play in teams. Michael and I were against James and Eddie. We each loaded our guns with the glow-in-the-dark pellets, and James and Eddie began to count to 30, giving Michael and I a head start. As we began running away, I instructed Michael to go on to the opposite hill that I went to. That way, if either of them finds one of us, the other can try and take them out. He followed my instructions, and we were soon situated on the peaks of each individual hill, scanning the ground below for potential targets. I cocked my airsoft gun and kept my finger on the trigger as I scanned the area. Eddie and James had finished counting and were trying to hunt down me and Michael. I laid down in the tall grass. My eyes were peeled, but in the dark woods, I was lucky to see 15 feet in front of me. There was a dim light in the distance from the streetlights on the main road, but it was nowhere near strong enough to penetrate through the leaves from the trees. My ears quickly adapted to the silence. The chirps of the crickets and the sound of mosquitoes buzzing around me filled my ear canal and forcefully banged against my eardrums. I had to periodically slap different parts of my skin that the mosquitoes had buried themselves into in order to keep them off of me. Through the leaves of the trees, in the dying light of the street lamp, I saw a man walking down the sidewalk. I couldn't make out much, if any, details about his physical appearance. At first glance, the way he walked seemed normal, but the slight idiosyncrasies were uncanny. His gait was more akin to an uneven hobble, as if he was limping. But the limp seemed to shift from one leg to the other, like he couldn't decide which leg to bear the weight on. His arms didn't sway naturally, they stayed pinned to his side. I watched as he approached the tall, old white picket fence gate with chipped paint, and it was there he stood completely still. It came in waves. The gentle breeze that gracefully walked across my back previously now stood at attention, and it seemed as though the air attempted to bring my body into the earth beneath me. The small animals that were moving around the tall grass all stood perfectly still, as if they were all suddenly taxidermized. The bugs and birds that were singing the song of the night all stopped in unison, in an orchestrated silence. The deafening silence left a vacuum in my ears, and the only sound that I could hear was that of my own blood circulating through my ears as my pulse steadily increased. My eyes were fixed on that gate, and it felt like I was frozen in time. The silence was violently cut by painful shrieking of the gate into the cemetery as it was slowly peeled open. Slow-moving footsteps painfully forced themselves onto the dirt path below them. As they got closer, I was able to make out more of the unknown man's details. His skin was pale and clung onto the bones underneath them, and I couldn't find a single hair on his body. His nose was abnormally long, prominently protruding out from his face and coming to a knife's tip at the end. He was dressed in jeans and a pristine ironed long-sleeve button-up shirt. The sleeves were neatly rolled to his elbows, revealing his forearms. The skin on his arms was so tight that I could see the separation of the two bones in the forearms. He stood still, no less than 20 feet ahead of me. He tilted his head back ever so slightly and opened his mouth. "Hey, come over here. I found them." I never saw his lips move after he opened his mouth. It was like he had a speaker in the back of his throat that projected his message out into the air at a volume just above a whisper. "They're here. Come here." The voice rang out once more into the dead air. On the second listen, I came to a realization that chilled my bones and sent goosebumps throughout my body. The voice coming out of the man's mouth was Eddie's. My breath was shallow. I could barely keep my arms up, as though they were crushed by their own weight. My hands were now plagued by tremors, and I was entirely unable to keep my gun steady. And from the corner of my eye, I saw James's silhouette lurking towards the man, towards the false version of Eddie's voice. I did the only thing I could think to do. I took aim and fired my airsoft gun at the man. I watched the luminescent green speck rip through the air, and it maintained a course straight for the man's head. The sound of the burst of air escaping my small plastic pistol rang out, bringing life back to the world around me. The pellet made contact with the man's head. He turned his head towards me. His cold, beady, black eyes cut through my own. I clamped my eyes shut. The vice of childlike logic of, if I can't see it, it can't see me, rapidly bounced around my brain. Footsteps rapidly pounded against the ground, bounding in my direction, and then I felt the unmistakable sting of a plastic pellet hitting my side. "I got Paul," James yelled out, beaming with pride. I opened my eyes. The man had vanished, and James was standing over me. Relief had reinvigorated my body, allowing strength to return to my legs. And as I stood, another burst of air sent another pellet ripping through the air and into James's chest. Another shot brought the silence of the cemetery to its knees, and I heard Eddie's voice boom across the small valley and into the night. Fuck. Michael had won us the round. My apprehension toward staying in the cemetery grew insurmountably, and I urged the group to stop with our festivities. I lied and said that my mother had texted me, letting me know that she was getting off from work early. Luckily for me, they didn't call my bluff, and we all returned home. James and I went up to the small room that we shared. Our bedroom was 12 feet by 8 feet, with 2 windows that looked out onto the street from the second floor of our small apartment. We had bunk beds, which were placed against the back wall. I got into the top bunk, and James got into the bottom bunk. Sleep didn't come easily that night. It repeatedly slipped from my grasp like sand through a sieve. Once I finally found sleep, it was swiftly interrupted by the sound of intermittent and uneven tapping against glass. I sat upright and crawled my way to the end of my bed, towards the window. As I approached, I saw a small green speck bounce off the window. The glow in the dark airsoft pellet. I looked out the window, down onto the street, and there he was. The only thing that had changed about his appearance was that he now had a small welt on his right cheek. He walked towards where the pellet landed, picked it up, and threw it against my window once more. It banged against the window with a surreal amount of force. A small chip appeared in my window, and in the faint reflection that I forced my eyes to bring into focus, the chip in the window was against my cheek, my right cheek. I forced myself to the back of my bed, my head against my pillow. I attempted to burrow myself deep into my mattress, to no avail. The tapping continued for several minutes before abruptly stopping. I heard the sound of tires against the rocky dirt outside my house. The flash of headlights flooded into the room. The car door opened and closed, and soon so did my front door. My mother was finally home, and I no longer had to rely on the faux safety of the blanket for protection. I finally found sleep. However, it was far from peaceful. My dreams were plagued by the man's presence. I repeatedly found him in my peripheral vision throughout my dreams. I dreamt that he followed me. He was around corners, behind doors, in the back of rooms that I was in. His mouth would open. "Come outside. Play with me." The list of voices in his arsenal weren't familiar to me, and for that I was thankful. He made promises, how I'd never be grounded. I'd never have to worry about rules, no curfew, and no punishments. If I close my eyes and allow myself a few brief moments of silence, I can still hear his final words to me. "I'll come back for you, Paul." The voice was warped and raspy, as if it was a new voice added to his collection that he was trying out for the first time. It was an attempt at James's voice. I woke up that morning in a cold sweat. My shirt was drenched, and it clung uncomfortably to my body. I jumped out from the top bunk to find my brother's bed empty and unmade. I walked out of my room and into my mother's. She was still dead asleep, recovering from the long night of work. I got to the top of the stairs to find the front door slightly ajar, the cool morning air spilling into the house. I walked down the stairs and closed it. I walked into the living room, empty, the kitchen, empty, the bathroom, empty. Panic set in. "Where's James?" I thought. I began to frantically double-check each of the 5 rooms in the house, causing enough noise to wake my mother up in the process. I ran next door to Michael's house and rapidly banged on the door as if I was a police officer about to start a raid. His mother answered the door in pajama pants and a bathrobe, still rubbing the sleep out of her eyes. She told me that James wasn't over there, and I should probably check Eddie's house before allowing panic to take hold. But it was too late. Panic already had its hand wrapped tightly around my throat. Every breath I took from then on was labored. I sprinted to Eddie's door, praying that James had simply ventured over there earlier than usual. I made a feeble attempt at collecting myself and banged on Eddie's door, much the same way I banged on Michael's. Eddie answered the door, a look of irritation smeared across his face. "Bro, do you know how early it is? James here?" The words escaped my mouth at such a rapid pace that he had to pause to comprehend what I had said. "What? No, why would he? When was the last time you saw him?" I was hyperventilating now, panic's grasp growing tighter and tighter against my windpipe. "When you guys went home after the airsoft war?" "Why?" "He's not home, and he's not at Michael's either." Eddie's eyes widened. His facial expression shifted from irritation to confusion to panic, all within an instant. He told me to run back home and see if James's phone was still there. Maybe he had gone somewhere without any of the rest of us, however unlikely that seemed. He said that he would get Michael out of bed, and they'd start running around, checking all the usual spots that we'd hang out. We promised to keep each other updated, and we split up to begin our search. I found James's phone on his bed in the mess of blankets and sheets that had been shifted around. His screensaver was a picture of the four of us, all together on the roof of a convenience store. We all looked so proud of ourselves. I opened his phone, no calls, no text messages, nothing that screamed, "Run away." I woke up my mother, and when I told her that I couldn't find James, she immediately sat up and sprung out of bed to begin her own search throughout the house, our backyard, and our neighborhood as a whole. Soon everyone, including Eddie's and Michael's parents, had organized a small search party. The police were called that morning. A swarm of cop cars descended upon our neighborhood. I answered a flurry of questions that night. At first, I was apprehensive about admitting that we played in the woods the night before, out of fear of reprisal and punishment from my mother. As I look back on it now, especially from the lens of a parent, that didn't matter. I told them about the man outside the window, but I didn't tell them about the different voices he used in an attempt to lure me out. I didn't say anything about his final words to me through the window. I didn't say anything about him using James's voice. Soon, the entire town was buzzing with police officers passing out flyers with James's school picture from the year before. Hundreds upon hundreds of flyers were given out, but nothing ever came of it. The police told us that they had found a lead a couple of times in the first couple of months, but they dried up quickly. The sands of time eroded the hope I had of ever seeing my brother again. It's been nearly a decade since I last saw him. I'm honestly not sure what makes me angrier nowadays. The fact that I couldn't protect him, or the fact that I can't remember his face without seeing a picture. Some days I wish that I had just gone outside when I saw the man tossing the plastic pellet against my window. So it's here that I submit to you all another legend based on a horrifying truth, the Whispering Man. And to James, if you're still out there and if you read this, please, please come home. I miss you. And although I never said it while you were here, I love you. If you thought that was creepy, the next story will send chills down your spine. I found a folder on my laptop that shouldn't be there, and it knows too much. I swear, the folder wasn't there the night before. I'm not the kind of guy who keeps a messy desktop. I'm almost obsessive about it. Clean folders, everything in its place. So when I powered up my laptop that morning and saw a new folder sitting right there, bold and unassuming, I froze. Unknown user. That was the folder's name. At first, I thought maybe it was a prank. My friends are the tech-savvy type, and I'd left my laptop at their place a few days ago. Maybe they got drunk, installed some creepy software to mess with me. But it didn't make sense. They wouldn't go this far for a laugh. I clicked on it. Nothing. It didn't open, didn't load. Nothing changed on the screen. Just this weird moment of hesitation, like the laptop itself was considering whether or not to let me in. And then, a line of text appeared across the top of my screen. You've been chosen. I blinked. Was it a pop-up? A message from some app? Maybe a virus? Before I could react, the folder disappeared, vanished, like it was never there. I leaned back in my chair, laughing nervously. Of course, it had to be a virus. Maybe I'd clicked something shady online. But as soon as I opened the browser to do a search, the screen flickered. Don't search. It's pointless. The words flashed across my screen in bold red letters. They lingered there, pulsing, as if the computer itself was taunting me. I closed the browser window and immediately shut down the laptop. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This wasn't funny anymore. Maybe it was a hack, something serious. I grabbed my phone to call one of my friends. Before I could dial, my phone lit up. Unknown number. I told you it's pointless. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. There was no way someone was listening, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling that my laptop, my phone, hell, maybe even my house, wasn't just compromised. It was watching me. I didn't touch my laptop for the rest of the day. I didn't even open my phone. Every little noise made me jump. Every creak in the walls, every gust of wind rattling the windows. By the time night rolled around, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. No one could hack a laptop that fast and interact with me in real time. It had to be some advanced phishing scam or something. I decided I'd take the laptop to a professional in the morning. Until then, I needed sleep. I locked the laptop in a drawer and crawled into bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a soft, persistent sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the drawer where I'd locked my laptop. I froze. The rational part of my brain told me it was just a random creak, maybe the house settling. But that tapping had a rhythm. It wasn't random. I got up slowly, heart hammering in my chest. The tapping continued, soft but steady as I approached the drawer. I could see the faint glow of light coming from the seams. My laptop was on. I hadn't left it on. With trembling hands, I unlocked the drawer and pulled it out. The screen was bright, and there was a single file open. It was a text document. You can't hide from me. Beneath that line was a series of photos. The first was of me, sitting at my desk, staring at my laptop from earlier that morning. The second was of me in bed, tossing and turning, unaware of anything. The third was a picture of me standing right there, in front of the open drawer. The laptop clicked off before I could react. By now, I was convinced someone had hacked my webcam or installed malware. But that didn't explain how it seemed to know where I was, even when the laptop was off. I unplugged the computer and removed the battery. If someone was controlling it remotely, that would stop them, right? Yet, even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My eyes kept darting to the corners of the room as if expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the shadows. That's when I noticed the new sound, a faint buzzing. Not from the laptop, but from my phone. My screen was lighting up again, over and over, as if someone was calling. I picked it up with shaking hands. A new number this time, but the same message appeared on the lock screen. I see you. I tried turning the phone off, but it wouldn't respond. It just kept buzzing in my hand like it was alive. Then, before my eyes, a new message appeared, this time from my own number. It's too late. You're already part of the game. My vision blurred. I had to sit down before I collapsed. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. This wasn't normal. This was something else, something I didn't understand, and no amount of logic could explain. That's when the voices started. They were faint at first, barely whispers, but growing louder with each passing second. I couldn't make out the words, just a constant stream of unintelligible noise. I clutched my head, trying to block them out, but they wouldn't stop. I slammed my phone into the wall, watching as it shattered into pieces. For a moment, the room was silent again, but the relief didn't last long. A soft chime echoed through the room. My laptop, battery removed, still locked in the drawer, had powered itself on. By now, I had to be losing my mind. I grabbed the laptop, fully prepared to smash it to pieces, but as I held it over my head, ready to throw it down, something caught my eye on the screen. A video call had opened up. No name, just a black screen, as if whoever was on the other end was watching from the shadows. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at the pixelated blackness. Then, slowly, a face began to emerge from the void. My face, but it wasn't a reflection. It was me, standing in my living room. I watched as the figure on the screen raised its hand, mirroring my movements. But the smile on its face wasn't mine. It was twisted, wrong, like a distorted version of myself. Then it spoke. "Don't you get it? This isn't a hack. This isn't some game you can win." The figure on the screen leaned closer, filling the entire display with its face. "I'm inside you now." For days after that, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every electronic device around me felt like it was pulsing with life, waiting to strike again. I trashed the laptop, bought a new phone, and even stayed at a hotel for a while, thinking I could escape whatever it was. But it didn't matter. Everywhere I went, I felt that presence, watching, waiting, controlling. It wasn't long before I started seeing the figure in reflections, mirrors, windows, even in the glossy surface of a car. The twisted version of me, always lurking just out of reach, smiling that horrible smile. It didn't speak again, but it didn't have to. I knew what it wanted. It was taking over. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. My mind is unraveling. I can barely tell what's real anymore. Is this my hand typing these words, or is it his? If you're reading this, maybe you've already seen the signs. The strange messages, the eerie glitches, the reflection that doesn't quite match. Maybe you think it's just a virus, just some glitch in your system. But it's not. They're already inside. And soon, they'll be coming for you. Final note, the story you just read may seem like fiction, but be cautious the next time you notice something strange on your device. Sometimes, the things we rely on to connect us with the world can also connect us to something far more sinister. Whatever you do, don't open the folder. It's already too late for me. The night isn't over. Here comes another scary story. I uncovered a dark underground operation deep in the caves. Now I fear for my life. I haven't got much time. They're at my door and have started trying to get in. My name is Luke Jacobs. I am of sound mind and not depressed. If I end up missing or dead, it is not for my own doing. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and now they are here to try and silence me. I have been noting down over the last few days what I experienced, in hope for some answers. The following events are based on what I can remember. I am a keen hiker, rock climber, and cave explorer. I live on the outskirts of a vast national park, which is ideal for all three. On my previous hike, I followed a short, steep trail that looped through a section of the forest. The walk took about 2 hours in total. Near the end of the route, I noticed a small, dark opening within the rock formation. It was around 60 yards away from the main trail. I curiously wandered over to take a look inside. It appeared to be quite a standard cave for the area. I took out my flashlight and inspected it for a moment. Emerging from the shadowy right-hand corner was a small, narrow crevice. It was an opening to a new cave system below. Unfortunately, I didn't have any of my caving gear with me, and it was getting late in the day, so I left and made my way home. I had the full intention of going back the next day to check it out. The next morning, around 5 a.m., I packed up my gear and drove over to a clearing in the forest. I had told my brother Sam the night before where I was going and what time I would be expected back. I did this as a routine whenever I went out hiking or caving, just in case the worst happened. I pulled up on the edge of the forest and made my way up the trail. I was excited to explore somewhere new. I had never noticed this cave before, even though I had frequently hiked the track over the years. The fact that there was a further cave system below was something I was excited to explore. The mudded trail was soft from the morning dew under my feet as I neared the cave. I turned off the main trail and waded through overgrown grass and bushes. My eager pace slowed. I looked with suspicion at the cave entrance. It had been loosely covered by branches and foliage. I moved the various branches and vines away and switched my flashlight on. I lit up the opening, making sure someone wasn't using it as a temporary shelter. It was empty. Though strange, I thought possibly another hiker had found this gem of a spot and wanted to make sure no one else got there before them. As I crouched and gradually made my way inside, I could hear faint dripping noises as condensation above fell around me. I stood on the edge of the narrow crevice. I peered over the lip and looked intently into the darkness. My flashlight revealed a massive cavity underneath, about 70 to 80 foot below. I prepared my harness, got bolted up to the cave wall. As I made sure everything was secure, I heard something echoing up from below. It sounded like inaudible shouting or screaming, but it could have easily been water or wind reverberating off the walls. It's amazing how far sound travels in enclosed places. I switched from the flashlight to my headlamp and began to make my descent. As I eased my way down, the bottom seemed brighter than I would expect. As my feet touched the floor, I gazed back up at the sunlit gap above. I unhooked myself from the tether and switched back to my flashlight. I looked back and forth. It looked more like a large tunnel than an enclosed cavity. The normally uneven ground was unusually flat and void. I noticed that the concave walls were all lined with dim lantern-style lights. This only intrigued me further. I wandered forwards cautiously until I was going around a slight bend. Again, I was hit with echoey shouts and screams. Now, I was sure they were definitely people. They weren't the kind of shouting you would expect from construction workers or an exploration party. No, it sounded much more sinister. My pure adventurous excitement was in that moment replaced by an unsettling feeling of dread. I looked at my cell phone. I knew it had no signal, but it was a nervous habit I had when I felt alone. After about 5 minutes of walking, my flashlight beam hit a jagged wall up ahead. The lights on either side of me meandered round as I came to a T-shape. I looked from left to right. Both led into darkness, as the wall-lined lights faded into the distance. A wave of petrified screams swept over me from the left. I swung my body over and scanned the area. On the gritted rock and limestone dust below, I could see thin tire tracks. I regrettably decided to follow the cries, but I just thought that a team of people had got into trouble down here. But I couldn't have been more wrong, as the more I stepped, the louder and more violent the cries became. I reached a sharp corner. I switched my flashlight off and peered nervously round. The narrow tunnel opened out into a massive lit cavern. I gasped, my face contorted in horror at the scene unfolding in front of me. 4 large floodlights exposed dozens of metal bar cages, each one housing 10 to 12 men, women, and children. Shockingly, they were being guarded by our own military personnel. Fully armed guards patrolled around the cages. Many of the helpless people inside were hysterically crying and comforting each other. Some just looked shell-shocked, staring straight ahead into nothing. Most wore dirt-stained and ripped clothing, with many looking in poor health. My eyes darted upwards as a red light flashed on the cave's ceiling. Everyone then slowly looked up as a siren droned out of a small loudspeaker placed in one of the corners. It was quickly accompanied by a mass of people gasping, then the screaming continued. A deep rumbling sound then came from the far end of the cave, like something heavy being scraped along the floor. 4 of the military guards then started pushing a cage full of people towards a dark point on the far side. It seemed to be a slope into another part of the cave. The trapped occupants started to pray and plead with the enforcers to stop, but it fell on deaf ears. The shrieking cries of help filled the air. Distress was visible in the onlookers' faces. They all slipped away into the darkness. A few moments of silence then pursued. Heavy, fast-paced footsteps began to echo out from the dark as the 4 military personnel came sprinting out of the shadows. What followed were horrific screams from the doomed captives. It was preceded by harsh sounds of metal twisting and snapping. The screams soon faded and were replaced by snarling noises and what I can only describe as ripping flesh. Then crash. The mangled cage suddenly came flying from the abyss. It was now blood-stained and empty. As the cloud of dust settled around it, mass hysteria erupted. The low rumbling noise sounded out once more as the ground vibrated. I couldn't believe what I had seen. These were our military, dehumanizing people, leading them to their certain death, feeding them to whatever them things were down there. I had to get some evidence, as no one would believe me. I took out my cell, hand shaking in fear and shock. I tried to take a photo. A bolt of light flashed around me. Shit, I had forgotten to take the flash off before taking it. Several guards then looked in my direction. They raised their rifles towards me. I turned to run, dust kicking up as a commotion ensued behind. As I ran, the lights began to get brighter until the whole tunneling cave was engulfed in light. I ran faster and faster. The sound of various hooks and clips on my harness resonated around me. My short, shallow breaths echoed off the limestone walls as I nearly missed the turn from where I entered. I skidded round the corner, catching my hand on a jagged rock. I winced in pain, but adrenaline kept me moving. I reached the cord and quickly clipped myself in. My blood-covered hands slipped as I tried to hoist myself up. I gained momentum and started to see daylight streaming through the rock opening. I could hear shouting and footsteps from the depths below. Someone yelled, "He went this way," while a second voice went, "Now cut them." It then went pitch black below me. They had turned the lights off, a second before I grasped onto the rocks above. I strained and squeezed myself out of the tight space, blood slowly running down my arm. My legs scrambled over the ledge, just as beams of light flooded the space underneath. I held my breath as one of the soldiers shouted out, "Clear!" I exhaled while slumping to the floor, trying to make sense of the last hour. Before I could compose myself, a voice barked out, "Up, up, up." I jolted to my feet as 6 bright red lasers streamed through the dusty opening, hitting the wall above. I stumbled frantically out of the cave. I didn't stop running until I had reached my car. I grabbed the first aid kit from my bag and wrapped a bandage around the blooded gash on my hand. I called my brother while driving home. I told him what happened. He, of course, didn't believe me. Sam said to stop winding him up. He was busy, and hung up the phone. I got home and tended to my wounds. Luckily, it looked worse than it was. I tossed and turned all night thinking about those poor people. Many of them looked like they were just picked off the streets. The next morning, Sam came to mine. I showed him my hand, told him every detail, and of course the photo I took. Finally, he began to see I was telling the truth. He said that I had to show him. I, of course, was hesitant. I explained that the U was military running it and they had seen me take a photo. Sam then came up with an idea. We would park up nearby and use his drone to check it out. I agreed. We drove over and pulled up on the side of the road. A lump formed in the back of my throat as Sam set up the drone. I directed him on where the cave was located. We both anxiously looked at his tablet, which was streaming the drone footage. I saw the overgrown patch outside the cave. I gestured for Sam to turn towards the cave opening. I muttered in disbelief, "What?" The cave opening was now replaced by loose rocks and rubble. The whole rock face appeared to have caved in. The camera footage then swerved and fell towards the ground. The screen went black, then signal lost. Something had happened to the drone. We both scrambled back into the car, and I drove home, dropping Sam off on the way. As the night set in, I noticed a black saloon car parked across the street from my house. It looked to occupy 2 people, both wearing suits. I studied it through my blinds, thinking to myself, what were they doing there? They were just sat staring forwards. Then out of nowhere, they both turned towards me. I recoiled back, the blind slats snapping shut, just as I heard an engine start. The car then sped off. Yesterday morning, I went into work. Halfway through my journey, I saw a black car in my rearview mirror. I couldn't tell if it was the same one, but it definitely seemed to be following me. I decided to check. I made 4 immediate right turns. It mirrored my every move until the last turn. The driver must have realized what I was doing and turned off just before I made it. I parked slightly away from the office, just so it wasn't obvious where I was. Silly looking back, really. If this was the government, they would know exactly where I was located and worked. I went into various meetings throughout the day as normal. As it neared 3 o'clock, I had a knock at my office door. It was the receptionist, Kelly. She asked to come in, as something weird had happened earlier in the day. She explained how 2 tall men, both dressed in black suits and wearing fedora-style hats, had come into the office. They were insisting to speak with me, and were prepared to wait. Kelly told them that I was out in meetings for the rest of the day. She described getting a strange, unnerving feeling about them. The most peculiar part was that they looked like identical twins. I thanked her. She had done the right thing. I looked back at the security camera footage. I could indeed see 2 men walk in. They spoke with Kelly and left within the space of 10 to 15 minutes. They were tall, bald, and had similar, if not the same features as one another. My mouth went dry as it suddenly dawned on me that whoever was running that underground hellhole knew my identity. I left early complaining of a headache and went back home. As I pulled down my street, I saw the black car once again. This time it drove straight past. The 2 men inside stared intently at me. Time seemed to slow as their gaze followed me until I had passed them. I rushed out of the car and through my front door. Something felt off. I walked through to the dining room. On the table I noticed a small envelope placed in the center. My paranoia was now really getting to me. Had they been in my house? What did they want with me? Deep down I knew the answers, and they were all confirmed once I opened it. Inside, 6 photos, all of me. They were taken within the cave system. I felt sick. Surely whoever was behind this would not let me live knowing what I had seen. I didn't go into the office today, as I feared for my safety. I stayed glued to my chair all day, staring at the photos, trying to figure a way out of this mess. The evening had started to set in. Headlights streamed through my window. The black car was back. It parked directly outside my house, and 2 doors began to open. The unsettling men walked expressionless towards my front door. I watched in terror through my blinds in anticipation. 3 large bangs rattled on the door. Now we are all caught up. Here I am in this messed up situation. I still haven't answered the door. How could I? It has all just gone quiet. Too quiet. I'm currently barricading the doors. I am optimistic about my chances of survival through the night. If I do make it, I will try to get you all some more answers. Hopefully the blurry photo I took down there will be enough proof for someone to believe me. If you do not hear from me, assume the worst has happened. Hold on tight. The next tale is just as terrifying. Roommate from nowhere at Ridgeway Hall. Moving to college was something I had been waiting for since I could remember. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, life had been predictable, too predictable. There were only so many times you could walk down the same 3 streets, wave to the same neighbors, and eat at the same diner before the monotony of it all began to eat away at you. College was supposed to be my ticket out, my chance to start fresh, to reinvent myself. I chose this university because it was far enough from home that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew, but not so far that I couldn't make it back if I needed to. The campus was beautiful, with sprawling green lawns, old brick buildings, and a mix of historical charm and modern innovation. Ridgeway Hall, the dorm where I would be staying, sat on the far edge of campus, a little separated from the newer buildings. It was one of those old, ivy-covered structures that looked like it had been around for centuries. When I first saw it, standing tall and slightly worn at the end of the long path leading from the main campus, it had an almost foreboding presence. The ivy snaked up the sides of the building, thick and dark, and the windows were narrow, their panes cloudy with age. There was something cold about it, something that made me shiver despite the late summer warmth. Ridgeway Hall, huh? The cab driver had said as he helped unload my bags. You'll hear some stories about that place. I had laughed it off at the time, eager to get inside and start unpacking. But now, as I stood in the entryway, staring up at the winding staircase and the dark wood-paneled walls, I felt a pang of unease. The building smelled faintly of old wood and something musty, like books that had been left in a damp basement for too long. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the floor. I hadn't expected luxury, of course. I had read the reviews and seen the pictures online. Ridgeway Hall was described as charming and historic, which I now realized were code words for outdated and creepy. I found room 318 on the 3rd floor, tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway. The door creaked when I pushed it open, revealing a small room with 2 twin beds, 2 wooden desks, and a single window that looked out over the campus. The walls were a dull, off-white color, and the floor was covered in an old, threadbare rug that had clearly seen better days. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the next few months, at least, I set my suitcase on one of the beds and looked around. The air in the room was stale, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. The window was slightly cracked, and when I walked over to close it, I noticed how dirty the glass was, making the world outside look hazy and distant. I could just make out the silhouette of the clock tower across campus, shrouded in mist from the light rain that had started falling. A sigh escaped me. It wasn't what I had imagined, but it would do. I spent the next hour unpacking, filling the dresser drawers with my clothes, and setting up my books on the desk. The emptiness of the room was unsettling, and the quiet was almost oppressive. There were no sounds of other students moving in, no doors slamming, no music playing down the hall. It was as if Ridgeway Hall existed in its own bubble, disconnected from the rest of campus. After finishing my unpacking, I decided to explore the dorm. The building had 3 floors, and from what I had read, it was one of the oldest structures on campus. The 3rd floor, where my room was located, seemed to be the least occupied. I passed by several closed doors, but I didn't hear any noise coming from inside. It felt like I was the only one here. The 2nd floor was a little more lively. I heard the faint sounds of conversation coming from one of the rooms, and the common area at the end of the hallway had a few people lounging on couches, scrolling through their phones. I waved to a couple of students as I walked by, but they didn't seem to notice me. They were too absorbed in their own world, which suited me just fine. The 1st floor, however, was eerily quiet. The lobby was dimly lit, the old chandelier casting flickering shadows on the walls. The floors creaked beneath my feet as I walked, and I could hear the faint hum of the building's heating system. There was a strange smell down here, too, something metallic mixed with the musty scent of old wood. It wasn't overpowering, but it was noticeable enough to make me wrinkle my nose. I found the laundry room and the small kitchen tucked away in a corner near the lobby. They looked as old as the building itself, with outdated appliances and peeling wallpaper. I wondered how many students had passed through Ridgeway Hall over the years. How many had lived in the same room I now occupied? The thought made me feel small, like just another temporary occupant in a place that had existed long before me and would continue long after I was gone. On my way back to my room, I passed an old corkboard near the stairwell, covered in faded flyers and notices. Most of them were announcements for events that had long since passed, but one flyer caught my eye. It was a simple white piece of paper with bold black letters that read, "Have you seen Ethan Marshall? Missing since last semester. If you have any information, please contact campus security." I stared at the flyer for a moment, my heart skipping a beat. Ethan Marshall. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. I hadn't heard anything about a student going missing before coming here, and the fact that the flyer was still up made me wonder if they had ever found him. The thought of someone disappearing from campus, especially from the same dorm I was now living in, sent a shiver down my spine. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably nothing. People went missing all the time, didn't they? It was probably unrelated to me or my new life here. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as I headed back to my room. Ridgeway Hall felt different now, darker somehow. The shadows seemed longer, the silence more oppressive. I was glad I wasn't alone. My roommate would be arriving soon, and having someone else around would make this place feel less haunted. When I reached my room, I noticed the door to the room next to mine, room 317, was slightly ajar. I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave that room all day, but now I could hear the faint sound of movement from inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I paused for a moment, listening. It was subtle at first, just the sound of fabric rustling, like someone shifting in bed. But then I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a desk, growing louder with each passing second. I didn't want to intrude, so I quickly stepped away and headed into my room, closing the door behind me with more force than I had intended. The tapping stopped as soon as my door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. I sat on my bed, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. I told myself it was nothing, just someone moving around in their room. But deep down, I knew something about this place wasn't right, and I hadn't even met my roommate yet. The following day, I woke up early, feeling a bit more settled after my strange first night. The rain had stopped, and the campus looked brighter under the pale morning sun. I decided to spend some time exploring the main part of the university, trying to familiarize myself with the layout of the buildings and find my way to the dining hall. It was a peaceful morning, with only a few students milling about. I grabbed breakfast, found a quiet spot outside, and enjoyed my meal while watching people pass by. It was nice to feel part of something bigger, even if I didn't know anyone yet. Later in the afternoon, I headed back to Ridgeway Hall, my thoughts drifting to my roommate. I still hadn't heard from him, and a part of me wondered if he had decided to back out last minute. The idea of having the room to myself was appealing, but at the same time, I was looking forward to meeting him. It would be nice to have someone around to share the experience of living in a new place. When I reached my room, I noticed the door was slightly open. My heart raced for a moment, thinking back to the flyer I had seen the day before about the missing student. But as I pushed the door open, I saw someone standing by the window, his back to me. He was tall, with messy brown hair and a relaxed posture, as if he didn't have a care in the world. He turned around as soon as I entered, flashing me a friendly smile. "Hey man, you must be Alex, right? Sorry I'm late. I'm Ethan." Ethan. My heart skipped a beat at the name. I forced a smile, trying to shake the unease that had suddenly gripped me. There was no way this could be the same Ethan from the flyer, right? "Nice to finally meet you," I said. Ethan immediately made himself at home, tossing his backpack onto the other bed and starting to unpack. He didn't seem to notice my hesitation, or if he did, he didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he launched into a casual conversation about the dorm, asking me how my first few days had been and whether I'd checked out the dining hall yet. Despite my initial wariness, I found myself warming up to him quickly. He was easy to talk to, with a laid-back vibe that put me at ease. Within minutes, we were chatting like old friends, swapping stories about our hometowns and our reasons for choosing this university. Ethan had a way of making everything feel normal, even when it wasn't. His presence was calming, and for the first time since I had arrived, I felt like I wasn't alone. We spent the rest of the evening talking, getting to know each other, and by the time I went to bed, I was glad to have him as my roommate. But as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about the flyer. "Have you seen Ethan Marshall?" I told myself it was a coincidence. There had to be more than one Ethan on campus, right? It wasn't an uncommon name. Besides, this Ethan was here, unpacking, settling in. He wasn't missing. And yet, the unease lingered. Over the next couple of weeks, life at Ridgeway Hall settled into a routine. Classes began, and I quickly found myself juggling the workload, figuring out which professors were sticklers for attendance and which ones didn't care if you ever showed up. College life felt like a blur of new experiences, late nights, and endless cups of coffee. Ethan and I got along surprisingly well. We didn't have any classes together, but we spent most evenings in our dorm room, chatting or doing homework. He wasn't much for small talk in public, and though I occasionally invited him to join me when I grabbed food at the dining hall, he often declined. It didn't bother me at first. I figured he was just more introverted than I was, preferring to keep to himself. But the more time I spent with Ethan, the more I started to notice the little things that didn't add up. For one, Ethan never seemed to eat, at least not when I was around. Whenever we sat in the dining hall together, he'd grab a tray like everyone else, but instead of eating, he'd just push his food around the plate, barely taking a bite. He'd talk and laugh like everything was normal, but his fork rarely reached his mouth. "Are you on some kind of diet?" I asked one afternoon as we sat in the dining hall. "You barely touch your food." He looked up from his tray, his expression calm. "Nah, just not that hungry. I guess I have a weird appetite." I nodded, not wanting to press the issue. But the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. It wasn't just his eating habits. Ethan didn't sleep either. At least, I never saw him sleep. Most nights, I'd go to bed around midnight, and Ethan would still be sitting at his desk, staring at his laptop or reading a book. I assumed he was just a night owl, but what really started to get under my skin was that he'd still be awake when I woke up in the morning. His side of the room was always perfectly neat, the sheets on his bed untouched, as if he hadn't slept at all. One night, I decided to ask him about it. "Hey, do you ever sleep?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "You're always up when I go to bed, and you're still awake when I wake up." Ethan glanced over at me, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I guess I just don't need as much sleep as most people," he said with a shrug. "I've always been like that." His answer was vague, but I didn't push it. Still, it left me feeling uneasy. I couldn't help but think about the missing student flyer I'd seen on the first day. "Have you seen Ethan Marshall?" And how no one on campus seemed to know my roommate. As strange as it all felt, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I mean, maybe he was just an unusual guy. Everyone had their quirks, right? And despite everything, I liked having him around. He was a good listener, always there when I needed to vent about a tough class or a weird interaction with a professor. But the small, nagging feeling that something wasn't right kept creeping back in. It started with subtle things, small enough that I could brush them off as my imagination. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange on Ethan's desk. He had left for the library, so the room was empty except for me. His laptop was closed, but his notebook was open, and there was something written on the page. I didn't mean to snoop, but the writing caught my eye. Thick, black letters scrawled in what looked like frantic handwriting. I leaned in closer, squinting to make out the words. "I've always been here. I've always been watching." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The words seemed to pulse on the page, like they were alive, breathing with some strange energy. I blinked, my head spinning. Was this a joke? A prank? I closed the notebook quickly and stepped away from the desk, trying to calm myself down. It was probably nothing. Maybe he was writing a short story or something for class. Writers sometimes scribble down weird ideas, right? But as I climbed into bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in the pit of my stomach. The next day I noticed more strange things. The way the lights flickered whenever Ethan entered the room, casting long, dark shadows across the walls. The way the air felt colder when he was around, as if his presence somehow drained the warmth from the space. The shadows themselves seemed to stretch farther than they should, crawling up the walls and wrapping around corners in ways that didn't make sense. I didn't say anything to Ethan, but I started to avoid him when I could. I made excuses to spend more time in the library, studying with classmates, or grabbing lunch off campus. I still couldn't bring myself to confront him. What would I even say? "Hey, I think you might be some kind of..." What? A ghost? A demon? I wasn't even sure what I was dealing with, but deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. The first real incident happened on a freezing January afternoon, right after the first big snowstorm of the season. Campus was buried under a thick blanket of snow, and the air was so cold it felt like my skin might crack. Most students had retreated indoors, but Ethan suggested we go for a walk to clear our heads. I agreed, hoping the fresh air might help me think straight. Maybe I was reading too much into everything. Maybe I was just stressed out from classes. I needed some time away from the dorm to clear my mind. We walked side by side across the campus grounds, the snow crunching under our boots as we made our way past the old brick buildings and through the empty courtyards. The campus felt deserted, almost abandoned, with only the occasional student hurrying by, bundled up in layers of scarves and jackets. At one point, I stopped to tie my shoelace, crouching down on the snow-covered path. Ethan waited for me a few steps ahead, watching as I fumbled with the laces. I glanced up, about to make a joke about how cold it was, but the words caught in my throat. There were no footprints where Ethan stood. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. I looked down at the snow around me. My own footprints were clear and deep, cutting a path through the snow as I had walked. But when I looked up at Ethan again, the snow beneath him was untouched, smooth and undisturbed, as if no one had been standing there. "Ethan," I said, my voice shaky. "Where are your footprints?" He glanced down, then back at me, his expression calm, almost too calm. "What do you mean?" I stared at him, my mind racing. "Your footprints. You've been walking this whole time, but there's nothing, no tracks." Ethan shrugged, his eyes dark and unreadable. Maybe the snow's just covering them up. That didn't make any sense. The snow hadn't been falling for hours, and my footprints were still clear as day. I opened my mouth to argue, but the look on his face stopped me. There was something in his eyes, something cold. I swallowed hard, standing up and brushing the snow from my jeans. "Yeah, maybe," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. We continued walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The unease gnawed at me, tightening like a knot in my stomach. I glanced back at our path again, and sure enough, there were only my footprints trailing behind us. The footprint incident gnawed at me for days. I couldn't stop thinking about how impossible it was, Ethan walking next to me with no tracks in the snow. I tried to explain it away, chalk it up to stress, exhaustion, maybe even paranoia. but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was missing something important. After a restless night, I made a decision. I had to figure out what was going on with Ethan. It wasn't just the footprints. It was everything. The way he never ate, never slept, the way the room felt colder when he was around. I wasn't crazy. There was something wrong with him, and I needed to know what it was. The first place I went was the dorm office. It was tucked away in a small, musty room in the basement of the administration building, where the floors creaked and the walls were lined with old filing cabinets. The dorm supervisor, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and thick glasses, sat behind a cluttered desk, typing away on an ancient computer. "Excuse me," I said, stepping up to the desk. "I have a question about my roommate, Ethan Marshall. I just wanted to check if there were any issues with his records, or if there was anything I should know." The woman glanced up at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Ethan Marshall? What room are you in?" "Room 318. She frowned and turned to her computer, typing in my room number. A few seconds passed, and her frown deepened. She clicked through a few more screens, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't have anyone by that name assigned to your room," she said, her voice confused. "It shows you're the only occupant of 318. Ethan Marshall never checked in. He was supposed to be assigned to your room at the start of the semester, but he never arrived." I stared at her, my mind reeling. "That's impossible. He's been living with me for weeks. We've been hanging out, going to class, everything. He's my roommate." The woman shook her head. "I'm sorry, but according to our records, Ethan Marshall never showed up. You've been listed as the only resident in that room." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words swirled around in my head, but they didn't make sense. Ethan wasn't real? How could he not be real? I had talked to him, spent time with him. He had unpacked his things in our room. He had walked beside me in the snow, even if the footprints weren't there. I don't understand," I finally stammered. "Can you check again? There has to be a mistake." The woman clicked through a few more screens, but she shook her head again. "No mistake. You're the only one in 318. I thanked her and left the office, my head spinning. How could this be happening? How could Ethan not exist? The weight of the situation pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I walked out into the cold winter air, trying to clear my head. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe the stress of moving to a new place, starting college, and adjusting to life away from home was messing with my mind. But it didn't feel like that. This was different. This was real. I knew Ethan was real. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, barely able to focus during my classes. My mind kept returning to the same question over and over again. Who is Ethan? By the time I got back to Ridgeway Hall that evening, the sky had turned dark, and the wind had picked up, howling through the narrow alleyways between the old brick buildings. I trudged up the stairs to the third floor, my mind still buzzing with questions. As I opened the door to my room, I was met with the same familiar sight. Ethan sitting at his desk, his back to me, staring at his laptop. "Hey," I said cautiously, stepping into the room. "You didn't happen to swing by the dorm office today, did you?" Ethan didn't turn around. "Nope," he replied, his voice as calm and relaxed as always. I hesitated, unsure of how to broach the subject. "So, I was there earlier. They said they didn't have you listed as my roommate. Like, officially. You never checked in." There was a brief pause, and for a moment I thought he might not answer. But then he spoke, his voice still eerily calm. "Yeah, that's weird," he said. "Probably just a mix-up. You know how those records are." I stared at the back of his head, my pulse quickening. "It's more than that. They said you never arrived on campus. They don't have any record of you being here." Ethan's fingers stopped typing, but he didn't turn around. "Huh, that is strange." He didn't offer any further explanation. No excuse, no protest. Just "that is strange." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "You never talk about where you're from," I said, my voice shaky, "or what classes you're taking. You don't eat, you don't sleep. And that day in the snow, you didn't leave any footprints." This time, Ethan did turn around. Slowly, almost deliberately, he swiveled his chair to face me. His eyes were dark, and there was something unsettling about the way he looked at me. Something I hadn't noticed before. "What are you trying to say, Alex?" he asked, his voice low. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "Who are you?" For a long moment, Ethan didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch farther than they should have, creeping up the walls like something alive. Then Ethan smiled. But it wasn't the friendly, easygoing smile I had grown used to. It was cold, distant, and somehow wrong. "I'm exactly who you think I am," he said quietly. "I'm your roommate, Alex, and I've been here the whole time." I took a step back, my heart racing. "But the records." "Records can be wrong," Ethan said, standing up from his chair. He took a step toward me, and the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows closing in around us. "People make mistakes." I felt trapped, backed into a corner by his presence. "What do you want?" Ethan tilted his head, his smile never fading. "I already have what I want. You." My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the room spin around me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Ethan wasn't real. He was never real. He was something else, something pretending to be my roommate, something that had been living with me, watching me. I turned and bolted for the door, my hand fumbling with the doorknob. But as I yanked it open, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, pulling me back. "You can't leave, Alex," Ethan whispered in my ear, his voice cold and sharp like ice. "You belong here now." I wrenched myself free from Ethan's grasp, stumbling out into the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran down the corridor, my feet slapping against the cold, tiled floor. I didn't know where I was going, anywhere but there. The hallway stretched on forever, the walls narrowing as I ran. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could hear the pounding of my heart in my ears. Behind me, I heard Ethan's footsteps, slow, deliberate, unhurried. He wasn't chasing me, but I knew he was following. He didn't need to run. He knew I had nowhere to go. I turned a corner and skidded to a stop. The hallway in front of me was gone, replaced by a wall of darkness. It was as if the building itself had swallowed the corridor, leaving nothing but a void in its place. I turned back the way I had come, but the hallway behind me had disappeared as well. I was trapped. Ethan's footsteps grew louder, echoing in the empty space around me. I pressed myself against the wall, my hands shaking, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But it was. "You can't run, Alex," Ethan's voice echoed through the darkness, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You're already mine." The air grew colder, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like the very life was being drained from me. The shadows twisted and writhed, closing in around me like black tendrils. I could feel Ethan's presence, closer now, suffocating, oppressive. I closed my eyes, my mind screaming for a way out, any way out. Suddenly, the pressure lifted. I opened my eyes, and I was standing outside Ridgeway Hall. The cold wind whipped at my face, and the night sky stretched out above me, clear and bright. The building loomed behind me, dark and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. I stumbled away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My legs felt weak, and my head spun with confusion. How had I gotten out? Had it all been a hallucination, a nightmare? As I stood there in the freezing cold, staring back at the window of room 318, my breath fogging the air in front of me, I couldn't make sense of it. Ethan was just standing there, his cold eyes locked onto mine, not moving, not blinking. For a moment, I felt paralyzed, unsure of what to do. It was already night, and the chill in the air was biting through my jacket. The campus was eerily quiet, the only sound being the soft whisper of the wind. I didn't have a choice. I had to go back inside. I turned and made my way back toward Ridgeway Hall, my steps slow and hesitant. The building loomed ahead of me, darker than it had ever seemed before. As I reached the entrance, the door creaked open with a groan that echoed in the stillness, as if the dorm itself were sighing at my return. The warmth inside hit me immediately, but it felt wrong. Thick and suffocating, like the air had grown stale and heavy in my absence. The hallway was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting strange shadows on the walls. As I walked down the corridor toward the stairwell, I swore I could see movement out of the corner of my eye. Flickers of darkness seemed to shift, almost as if the shadows themselves were alive, creeping along the walls and floors. I glanced over my shoulder, my heart racing, but there was nothing. just the empty hallway behind me, as silent and still as it had been moments before. I reached the stairs and ascended to the third floor, my hand gripping the railing tightly. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air was pressing down on me. By the time I reached my floor, the entire building seemed unnervingly quiet, too quiet. No sounds of other students moving about, no music, no voices, just the sound of my own breathing, shallow and uneven. When I reached my room, I stopped in front of the door to room 318. My hand hovered over the knob, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to go inside, but I had no other option. With a deep breath, I pushed open the door. The room was empty. Ethan was gone. His side of the room looked untouched, as if he had never been there in the first place. The bed was perfectly made, the desk neat and orderly, no sign of his presence. But something was wrong. The air in the room was colder than the rest of the dorm, and the shadows that filled the corners seemed darker, thicker. I stepped inside cautiously, the door creaking shut behind me with a soft click that made me jump. As I moved toward my bed, I noticed small, strange things out of place. The lamp on Ethan's desk flickered on and off, casting brief bursts of light that made the shadows dance in ways that defied logic. A soft tapping sound echoed from the walls, like fingers drumming in a slow, deliberate rhythm, though there was no one there. The tapping would start and stop at random intervals, each time sending a chill down my spine. The wind outside howled, but the sound seemed to filter through the walls, as if the building itself was breathing. I sat on my bed, my back pressed against the headboard, trying to steady my thoughts. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed things moving out of the corner of my eye. Small, fleeting shadows skittering across the floor, the faint sound of whispers that I couldn't quite understand. It felt as if the room itself was alive, watching me, waiting for something. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in my bed, heart racing, eyes darting around the room. The strange occurrences persisted throughout the night. At one point, I heard a door slam down the hall, but when I opened my door to check, the hallway was empty. The dim lights above flickered ominously, casting long, unnatural shadows that stretched and twisted along the walls like grasping hands. Hours passed like a blur. The entire dorm seemed eerily deserted, as though I were the only one left inside. The oppressive quiet was unbearable, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling and the unsettling whispers that continued to swirl around me, just out of earshot. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the strange occurrences stopped. Morning came with the soft light of dawn filtering through the grimy window. The warmth of the sun seemed to banish the shadows that had haunted the night, and for the first time since I had returned to the dorm, I felt like I could breathe again. I was exhausted, my body heavy with fatigue, but the unease in my chest had lifted slightly. I convinced myself that it was over, that whatever had happened during the night was done. I left my room, eager to escape the stifling atmosphere of Ridgeway Hall. As I walked down the stairs, I overheard a group of students whispering in the lobby. They spoke in hushed voices, their faces pale with shock. "Did you hear? They found a student in one of the rooms on the third floor." My heart skipped a beat and I stopped in my tracks, listening closely. "Who was it?" one of the students asked. "They said it was Ethan Marshall," another replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He went missing last semester, and they found him this morning, lifeless, in room 317. A chill ran down my spine. Room 317, the room next to mine. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization hit me like a wave. Ethan, the Ethan I had spent nights talking to, laughing with, had been gone this entire time. The Ethan I knew wasn't real. He had never been real. He was nothing but a ghost, trapped in this place, pretending to be alive. I stumbled back, the world around me blurring. Ethan had been reaching out, searching for something, closure, perhaps. And now, with his body found, maybe he had finally found it. I couldn't stay in Ridgeway Hall any longer. I packed my things and moved to a different dorm that same afternoon. The air felt lighter in the new building, the silence not so oppressive. But even as I settled into my new room, far from the haunted halls of Ridgeway, I couldn't shake the feeling. Somewhere, in the shadows of Ridgeway Hall, Ethan was still watching. And though I had left, a part of me knew that I could never truly escape. There's always another nightmare waiting. Let's dive into the next one. I thought ignoring them would keep me safe, until they dared to take my grandma's form. Ever since I was a child, I've been able to see things that no one else could. These weren't just fleeting shadows or ghosts from nightmares, but strange and terrifying creatures with shapes I couldn't even begin to describe. They weren't human, nor were they any kind of animal I'd ever known. They were grotesque figures, twisted and distorted in ways that defied nature. I saw them everywhere, at any time. In school, while I was sitting in class, I would sometimes see them lurking in the corners of the room, hiding in the shadows under the desks, or crouching on top of the bookshelves, their empty eyes staring straight at me. When I walked down the street, they would suddenly appear from the shadows of narrow alleys, as if they had been there all along, just waiting to reveal themselves. They followed me with every step, making me afraid to walk alone as the evening began to fall. But the most terrifying thing was when I realized they didn't just appear in public places. They had also crept into my own home, in the dark corners where the light couldn't reach, under the bed, inside the closet, or sometimes just in a small corner of the living room. They were there, like a part of the space itself. I tried telling my parents about what I saw, but they only laughed, thinking I was just imagining things. They chalked it up to the vivid imagination of a child, or simply childhood nightmares. But I knew these weren't hallucinations. I could see them as clearly as I saw my own family. The only person who believed me was my grandmother. She was the one who didn't laugh when I talked about these terrifying creatures. Instead of dismissing me like my parents, she gently took my hand and said, "Don't react, don't look at them for too long, and absolutely don't answer them. If you ignore them, they'll go away." From that day on, she taught me how to ignore these creatures. Every time they appeared, I had to focus on something else, pretend I didn't see anything at all. She warned me that if I paid too much attention to them, they would realize I could see them, and that would lead to dire consequences. My grandmother and I were very close. She wasn't just my protector against these monstrous entities. She was the only one who truly understood me. She always taught me how to live with the fear, how to stay calm when those creatures were nearby. Thanks to her, I managed to get through a haunted childhood without losing my mind. But as time passed, I grew older, and my grandmother grew weaker. The years took their toll on her body, slowing her down. Each step she took seemed to drain a little more of her life force. Her once sharp eyes began to grow dim, her vision no longer as clear as it used to be. Sometimes I saw her squinting to see things clearly, and a deep fear welled up inside me. I worried that one day, her failing eyesight would no longer distinguish between reality and the monstrous, between human and demon. And then that dreaded day came. One morning, when I was at school, in the middle of class, my phone started vibrating. It was my parents calling, their voices heavy and filled with sorrow. They told me that the hospital had just called. With the news, my grandmother had passed away. The doctors said she had died of old age, peacefully in her sleep, without any pain. But even as they spoke, I felt a cold dread settle in my chest, knowing that the explanation didn't bring any real comfort to the overwhelming grief that followed. Deep down, I knew that wasn't the real reason. She had warned me about this many times, about the danger she always feared. I couldn't believe she had simply passed away due to age. My heart ached with the thought that, in the dark of night, when she was alone with the shadows, her eyes had failed her, and she couldn't distinguish between human and demon. Perhaps she had seen one of them and mistaken it for someone she knew. Perhaps she had unwittingly responded, and then they killed her. The pain of losing her overwhelmed me. I couldn't accept that the one person who understood and protected me was gone. Each day that passed, the emptiness inside me grew. I tried to carry on, to stay calm and follow her teachings, but the void and fear only deepened. Then one day, as I was walking along the path where my grandmother and I used to stroll, I saw her. She was standing in the distance, her back turned to me, but I recognized that familiar figure immediately. My heart raced, overwhelmed with joy. All my thoughts blurred in that moment. Nothing mattered except the sheer happiness of seeing her again. I couldn't hold back my emotions. Without questioning it, without wondering if it was real or just my longing playing tricks on me, I found myself running toward her, desperate to be close to her once more. I called out to her, my voice trembling with excitement and relief. She turned around slowly, her familiar warm smile spreading across her face, just as it always had. For a moment, everything felt right again, as if she had never left. But as I hurried closer, something in her expression began to shift. The warmth in her eyes started to fade, replaced by a chilling emptiness. Her smile, once so comforting, began to twist and contort, the edges stretching into an unnatural grin that no longer resembled the loving grandmother I knew. Rage flared up inside me when I realized that these demons had dared to take on my grandmother's form, the only person who had ever protected me. They had twisted her face into something grotesque and evil. How dare they? They hadn't just shattered the peace in my world. They had torn apart the most cherished memory I had of her. I couldn't contain myself any longer. I screamed, cursing the demons, my hands shaking with fury. But in that moment, I realized I had made a fatal mistake. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind, "Don't react." But it was too late. They knew I could see them. They knew I was afraid. From the surrounding darkness, more and more of these creatures began to appear. They slithered out from every shadow, from the thickening night surrounding me. They were no longer just fleeting figures. They were enormous, horrifying entities with empty eyes and twisted faces. The sound of their cold, hissing breaths grew louder, closer, as if they were about to consume me. The darkness closed in, so thick I could hardly breathe. They were here. I could feel their icy breath on the back of my neck. They were getting closer. Ready for more? The next story will leave you with goosebumps. I took my family to a water park. It ruined our lives. If I had $1 for every time I'd told the detectives this story, maybe I'd have enough to retire. Fly off to an island and drink my way to a not-so-early grave. I remember our last conversation well enough. "Okay, buddy, we're right here. If you hurry, we can hit the wave pool before we go." I ruffled Will's hair, gave him a little push. He folded his arms, defiant. "The racing slide. It's the funnest one." "Most fun," I corrected. "And whatever you say, Willie." He nodded with a satisfied and scurried off. He weaved his way through the molasses of the crowd, splitting families and couples as he homed in on the dilapidated porta-potty. This was one of the few recent attempts Will had dared to use the bathroom all by himself. He was capping a good run, but being out of the house, I kept an eye on the door for any signs of distress. Said it 100 times, I would have noticed anyone coming or going. Maybe 5 seconds I looked away. Was that enough time for him to jump out? And, what, run off in the opposite direction? About 5 minutes after he had gone, I got up. I leaned on a casual arm against the porta-potty. In a whisper shout over the drone of the few hundred happy pool-goers behind me, "Buddy, it's me. How's it going in there?" There was movement inside, I swear it wasn't my imagination. I heard something. I turned and saw my wife, dipping dots in one hand and waving with the other. Can't call it a day at the water park without ice cream. I smiled and wrinkled my nose as a joke. "All right, Will, I'm coming in." The door was unlocked. I made an effort to open it as little as possible and slip inside. I did a double take, turned a full 360, checked the neighboring porta-potty and returned. No, he couldn't have. I peered down past the toilet seat. Log-sized turds floated in the septic stew below. "Will?" I stepped outside and circled the porta-potty. "Will?" I called again. My wife appeared next to me, holding Lila's hand. "What happened? Where's Will?" she asked. "I don't know. He was inside." "Lila, did you see him leave at all?" My daughter shook her head, thrusting a spoonful of dots into her mouth. "You were supposed to be watching him," my wife said. "I know." I grabbed the arm of a man nearby. "Excuse me, sir, did you see my son leave this porta-potty here?" I described Will in detail. He saw the desperation in my eyes but shook his head. "Sorry, try the lifeguard station. I'm sure this happens all the time." He wished us luck and I thanked him. My wife was beginning to cry. She was starting to scare Lila. I ran ahead, cutting through one of the splash pads and hopping the fence to the lifeguard station. "Oh, excuse me, sir." Some acne-riddled teenager with a red and white uniform stood up from behind the desk. "You, my son. I can't find my son. Is there some announcement you can make, something?" The teen closed his eyes. Yay, give me 1 sec. I kind of knew, so I think. I don't have a second. If you can't help, then get me a goddamned manager. I snarled. A petite girl, also in high school by the looks of it, turned the corner, oblivious to the nature of the conversation. Hey, you can't talk to him like that, she pouted. There's no need to be rude. I stabbed my finger at her, my temper at the end of its wick. I'll be as rude as I damn well like. Get me a fucking manager, or I'll go back there and find one. The police were called, primarily for me. I was screaming, knocking things over, foaming at the mouth, my wife said. The cops said I would have to calm down or they'd handcuff me. They sent out an announcement over the park's PA system. William, your parents are looking for you at the lifeguard station. If you can find a lifeguard, we can get you back together as soon as possible. Don't worry, the lifeguard manager said. We radioed all our employees. He'll be back in no time at all. As it turns out, lost and found children in places like these is fairly common. The problem was, Will never turned up. How do you go home after that? We stayed as long as we could, but it's not like we could sleep on the slides. So the same day I left for the water park with my family, we returned, one short. Lila didn't know what was happening. We told her Will had gotten lost and the police were looking for him. She asked why we weren't looking for him. She began to cry. The funny thing about humans is how simultaneously effective and ineffective we are at lying to ourselves. Because a deep part of yourself, something in your core where you know you can trust it, smells the bullshit. And yet we'll take that lie and run, far as we can, until our legs give out or we crash face first into a wall. After the first day, that piece of me in my core knew I'd never see Will again. But I ran like hell. My lust for closure deflated my marriage like a water balloon with a leak. I was stupid to think I wouldn't get laughed out of the court during custody proceedings. But the one reprieve I had came yesterday. If I couldn't have answers, if I couldn't have my family or my son back, then I'd have some sweet revenge. This last year, I'd been leading media campaigns, doing interviews, degrading myself to what I used to frown on and call an activist, all to destroy the water park that took my son. The park was small, got a lot of bad press in the local outlets where most of their customers were. Apparently, this wasn't the first incident in the park's history. Far from it, actually, having a long list of lawsuits and scandals. But it was the last straw, and eventually, they were forced to close. Yesterday was the first day of the demolition. I watched it in person, one-man audience, and it felt good. I was getting ready to leave around midday when a commotion in the site held me. Axe! Grab the axe! The crew was in mayhem, and advantageous to my curiosity, no one was around to stop me hopping the barrier to get a closer look. It's dead! Stop! It's dead! I was too far to see what the men were standing over and crept closer. Fucker, that's a world record. Call someone. Who? The police? Animal control. Call someone. Christ's sake. Where did you find it? In here. Well, go check it. Be careful too. I felt my way along a bulldozer, close enough now, and stuck my head past the edge. The scene made my knees buckle. Dead, and covered in hacks and slash marks, was a python. Never mind a snake, it was the largest animal I'd even seen up close, long as a school bus, longer even, stretched out. Despite its size, it looked thin, as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. Tell me what happened, one of the construction crew asked a younger member. We was using the machine and clearing the area like you said. Went and knocked over them porta potties and the dragon came, rearing its head, out one of them holes beneath. The crew began to buzz, taking pictures of the beast and kicking it. The construction man nodded and called for the worker who had gone to check the hole. Come on out, that's a shithole, nothing to find. The boss. The site fell silent. What is it? There's bones. There's bones down here. After all the pieces were collected, the bones they found belonged to 10 unique skeletons. It was a reticulated python, the invasive one, 26 feet long. Found the humidity of the park nice and chose a place it wouldn't be found. Headlined the local paper for a day before it was pulled. Previous owners of the park still had some influence in the area. And what did I get? Closure? I would have rather been buried with my unanswered questions.